The bitter wind carried the scent of snow and desperation as it whipped across Black Pine Ridge. Eleanor Morgan stood alone, one hand pressed against her useless right eye, the other clutching a tattered shawl that offered little protection against the Dakota Territory's merciless autumn chill. The wagon train had vanished hours ago, leaving nothing but fading wheel tracks in the hard-packed earth and the hollow echo of promises broken. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They really did it, she whispered, her voice swallowed by the vastness around her. They really left me behind. The realization settled into her bones, colder than the wind itself. She had seen the looks exchanged over the campfire the previous night, had noticed how the other settlers averted their eyes when she approached. After her father's death 3 weeks earlier, their patience had worn thin. A half-blind girl with no husband and no family was just another mouth to feed, another burden to bear on the treacherous journey west. "She'll slow us all down," William Thornton had muttered, not quite quietly enough. "That clouded eye of hers means she can't even mend properly, let alone help with the hunting or cooking." Ellie touched the milky surface of her right eye, a childhood illness having stolen half her vision years ago. She had learned to compensate, had taught herself to listen more carefully, to feel changes in the air, to make do. But the settlers had seen only limitation, only weakness. The canteen they'd left her contained barely a day's worth of water. The small bundle of provisions wouldn't last much longer. Ellie took stock of what remained. Her father's compass, a small knife tucked in her boot, the tattered map he'd been working on before fever took him. A cartographer by trade, Thomas Morgan had taught his daughter the art of map-making, of finding one's way in a world that offered no clear paths. "East leads back to the last outpost," she murmured, pulling the compass from her pocket. "But that's 4 days' walk at least." The nearest settlement in the other direction was nearly a week away, beyond her limited supplies. Ellie swallowed hard against the dryness in her throat. She would not cry. Tears were a luxury she could no longer afford. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, Ellie made a decision. She would follow Wolf Creek northward. Her father had mentioned Lakota territories in that direction. It was a risk. The settlers had spoken of the native tribes with fear and suspicion, but dying alone in the wilderness seemed the grimmer alternative. The first night alone was the hardest. Every rustling leaf, every distant animal call sent her heart racing. She made a small shelter beneath a rocky overhang, her back pressed against stone, knife gripped in trembling fingers. Sleep came in fitful bursts, broken by the cold and the constant vigilance her situation demanded. By midday of the second day, Ellie's water was gone. Her lips had cracked and her tongue felt swollen in her mouth. The world wavered at the edges of her already limited vision, mirages dancing across the plains like mocking specters. She had been careful with her rations, but dehydration was setting in faster than she'd anticipated. The terrain grew more rugged as she continued north, the flat plains giving way to scattered pine and rocky outcroppings. Wolf Creek had narrowed, the water level dropping to reveal smooth stones and patches of mud. Ellie knelt beside it, cupping the cold water in her hands and drinking deeply despite the silty taste. It was while she bent over the creek that she first sensed she was being watched. Nothing obvious, no sound or sudden movement, just a prickling awareness at the back of her neck, the feeling of eyes tracking her movements. Ellie straightened slowly, her hand drifting toward the knife in her boot. "Hello?" she called, her voice hoarse and uncertain. "Is someone there?" Silence answered her. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the promise of coming snow. Ellie scanned the ridge above her, her good eyes straining to detect any sign of movement. Nothing. Perhaps hunger and exhaustion were playing tricks on her mind. She continued, onward, each step growing heavier than the last. The temperature dropped as afternoon faded into evening, and Ellie knew she needed to find shelter before nightfall. The sky had taken on a threatening grey pallor, heavy clouds gathering on the horizon. It was then that she saw him. He stood atop a rocky outcropping, still as the stones beneath his feet, a bough slung casually across his back. His dark hair was braided on one side, loose on the other, framing a face as weathered and unyielding as the landscape itself. A Lakota hunter, watching her with eyes that missed nothing. Ellie froze, fear and hope warring within her chest. She had nothing to offer, no way to communicate, no reason why he should help rather than harm her. Her fingers tightened around, the knife in her pocket, though she knew it would provide little protection. "Please," she said, the word escaping before she could stop it. "I need help." The man made no response, his expression unchanging as he studied her. Then, with a fluid grace that made Ellie suddenly conscious of her own exhaustion-clumsy movements, he descended from the rocks. He approached slowly, stopping several paces away, close enough to see her clearly, far enough to react if she posed a threat. His gaze lingered on her clouded right eye, not with disgust or pity, as the settlers had shown, but with simple observation. He spoke, a single word in his native tongue that Ellie couldn't understand. "I don't," she began, gesturing helplessly, at her ear and then at him. The hunter considered this, then pointed to himself. "Maka," he said, the syllables clear and deliberate. His name. He was giving her his name. "Ellie," she responded, pressing her hand to her chest. "Eleanor Morgan." Maka nodded once. His gaze swept over her again, assessing her torn dress, her cracked lips, the way she leaned slightly to favor her blistered right foot. Without a word, he turned and began walking north, in the direction from which he had come. After a few paces, he stopped and looked back at her, his meaning clear. Follow or stay behind. It wasn't a command, but it wasn't quite an invitation either. Ellie hesitated for only a moment before limping after him. Death was certain if she remained. Alone, following this stranger offered at least the possibility of survival. The storm hit sooner than either of them expected. Within an hour, the first snowflakes began to fall, thick and wet, quickly covering the ground in a treacherous blanket of white. The wind howled through the pines, driving the snow sideways, stinging Ellie's exposed skin like tiny needles. Maka increased his pace, forcing Ellie to push her exhausted body beyond what she thought possible. Her lungs burned with the effort, each breath a painful gasp in the frigid air. Just when she thought her legs would give out beneath her, they crested a small hill, and Ellie saw the village below. It wasn't large, perhaps 20 structures arranged in a rough circle, smoke curling from several of them, despite the wind's best efforts to scatter it. Hide-covered lodges, some adorned with painted symbols whose meanings Ellie couldn't begin to guess. Maka led her toward one of the larger dwellings near the center of the settlement. As they approached, Ellie became aware of eyes tracking their progress, women pausing in their work, children stopping their play, warriors straightening from tasks to observe the strange, half-blind white girl stumbling after one of their hunters. At the entrance to the lodge, Maka stopped, calling out something in his language. After a moment, the flap was pulled aside and an elderly woman emerged. Her face was a map of deep lines and weathered wisdom, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in 2 long braids, her dark eyes, bright and sharp despite her advanced years, fixed immediately on Ellie. She spoke, rapid and questioning, to Maka. He responded calmly, gesturing toward the ridge from which they had come, then to Ellie's eye, then making a motion like someone walking alone. The old woman frowned, her gaze never leaving Ellie. "We chapi," she finally said, touching her own chest, mirroring Ellie's earlier introduction. "Ellie," she responded, her voice barely audible over the wind. Wichapi's expression softened slightly. She reached out, her fingers brushing against Ellie's cheek, then moved aside, motioning for her to enter the lodge. The interior was warm, almost overwhelmingly so after the biting cold outside. A fire burned in a central pit, smoke rising to escape through a hole in the top of the structure. Furs lined the floor and various implements hung from the supporting ampoules, cooking tools, weapons, bundles of herbs whose pungent scent filled the air. Ellie swayed on her feet, the sudden warmth making her lightheadedness worse. Wichapi guided her to a pile of furs near the fire, pressing firmly on her shoulders, until she sat. The old woman knelt beside her, examining her more thoroughly now that they were in better light. She clucked her tongue at the state of Ellie's feet when she removed her tattered boots. The blisters had broken, leaving raw, angry skin exposed to dirt and cold. Wichapi spoke sharply to Maka, who nodded and left the lodge, returning moments later with a clay pot of water and several bundles of what appeared to be medicine. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As Wichapi began cleaning her wounds, Ellie fought to stay conscious. The combination of warmth, the cessation of movement, and her body's desperate need for rest was pulling her rapidly toward unconsciousness. The last thing she remembered before darkness claimed her was the old woman's hands, gentle despite their strength, careful despite their efficiency, and the strange melodic flow of words spoken in a language she couldn't understand, but whose tone conveyed more compassion than she had experienced in weeks. Ellie woke to the scent of something cooking, meat and herbs she couldn't identify. For a moment, confusion reigned. The hide walls around her, the unfamiliar bedding beneath her, the soft sound of a woman humming nearby, none of it aligned with her last clear memories. Then it rushed back, the abandonment, the desperate journey north, the Lakota hunter, the storm, the grandmother. Ellie pushed herself upright, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles. Her feet had been wrapped in soft hide bandages, and someone had changed her into a clean deerskin dress while she slept. Wichapi sat at the fire, stirring something in a clay pot. She looked up as Ellie moved, her expression neutral but not unwelcoming. "How long?" Ellie asked, gesturing at the bandages, then miming sleep. The old woman held up 2 fingers. 2 days. She had slept for 2 days. Wichapi ladled some of the stew into a wooden bowl and brought it to Ellie, along with a water-filled hide pouch. Ellie's stomach growled loudly at the smell, and she accepted both with murmured thanks that went uncomprehended but not unappreciated. The stew was rich and flavorful, unlike anything she had eaten with the settlers. Dark meat, venison perhaps, with roots and berries that gave it both sweetness and depth. Ellie ate slowly, savoring each spoonful, knowing her shrunken stomach would rebel if she rushed. As she ate, Maka entered the lodge, shaking snow from his shoulders. Winter had arrived in earnest during her sleep, it seemed. He spoke briefly to his grandmother, then turned his attention to Ellie. "You are better," he said, the English words careful but clear. Surprise must have shown on her face, for the corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been amusement. "I trade with white men," he explained. "I learn words." "Thank you," Ellie said, setting her empty bowl aside, "for helping me." Maka's expression darkened slightly. "Why you alone? Where is your people?" The question, simple as it was, drove into Ellie's chest like a blade. "They left me behind," she said, her voice catching. "My father died. They didn't want to care for me because of this." She gestured to her blind eye. Maka relayed this to Wichapi, whose face hardened as she listened. The old woman spat something that sounded like a curse, then rose and began gathering items from around the lodge. Herbs, strips of leather, small carved objects Ellie couldn't identify. "What is she doing?" Ellie asked. She makes medicine, Maka replied, for your eye. Ellie shook her head quickly. No, it can't be fixed. I've been half blind since I was a child. Maka translated, and Wichapi responded with a dismissive wave of her hand, continuing her preparations. Grandmother says all things can be healed, Maka said. Maybe not to see again, but to be strong in other ways. That night, as snow piled high against the sides of the lodge, Wichapi performed what Ellie could only think of as a ceremony. She burned sweet-smelling herbs that filled the air with fragrant smoke, sang in a low, rhythmic chant, and applied a poultice to Ellie's blind eye, a mixture that tingled against her skin but caused no pain. Maka explained little, simply saying, "Grandmother is Wichasha Wakan, holy woman. She knows many medicines." When it was over, Wichapi bound Ellie's eye with a soft cloth and spoke at length to her grandson. Maka nodded, his expression solemn. "What did she say?" Ellie asked when the old woman had retired to her sleeping place. "She says you will stay until spring," Maka replied. "Too dangerous to travel now, snow too deep, too cold." "And then?" Maka studied her for a long moment. "Then you choose. Go or stay." The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm Ellie had never expected to find among people she had been taught to fear. As her strength returned, Wichapi began teaching her the basics of their language, starting with simple nouns: fire, water, food, and progressing to more complex concepts. In turn, Ellie shared what she knew of map-making, drawing the surrounding territories in the dirt floor of the lodge, explaining the symbols her father had taught her for mountains, rivers, and settlements. Maka showed particular interest in this skill, recognizing its value for hunting and trading journeys. When her feet had healed enough to walk without pain, Ellie began accompanying Wichapi around the village. The initial wariness of the other Lakota gradually gave way to cautious acceptance. The children were the first to warm to her, fascinated by her different appearance and especially by her maps, which she drew for them in the snow. Winter deepened, bringing storms that howled around the lodges and days of bitter cold that kept everyone close to their fires. During one such storm, Maka returned from a hunting trip with a fresh deer across his shoulders and a grim expression. After the meat had been prepared and portions shared with others in the village, he spoke quietly to Ellie and his grandmother. "White men," he said, pointing west. "Soldiers, maybe 30, maybe more." Ellie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Did they see you?" Maka shook his head. "No, but they look for something." "Or someone," Wichapi added, her English halting but improving. She looked pointedly at Ellie. "The settlers wouldn't send soldiers after me," Ellie protested. "I'm not worth that trouble." "Not for you," Maka agreed. "For land, for gold, always same reason." That night, unable to sleep, Ellie sat by the dying fire, turning her father's compass over in her hands. The brass case was dented, the glass covering the needle cracked, but it still pointed true north. Thomas Morgan had relied on it for years, using it to chart territories from the Mississippi to the Rockies. "He teach you?" Maka's voice came softly from the darkness. He moved to sit across from her, the firelight casting deep shadows across his face. "My father?" "Yes." Ellie held out the compass. "He taught me everything he knew about finding my way." Maka took it, examining the instrument with careful fingers. "But you still become lost." The observation stung with its simple truth. "Yes," she admitted. "Without him, I was lost." He handed the compass back. "Tomorrow I teach you to not be lost." True to his word, Maka began Ellie's education at dawn the next day. Despite the cold, he led her to the edge of the village, pointing out subtle markers in the landscape, the way certain trees bent with the prevailing wind, how snow accumulated differently on north-facing slopes, the patterns ice formed on still. Water. Compass good, he said, but eyes better, ears better, feel of wind on skin better. Day after day, as winter maintained its grip on the land, Maka expanded her lessons. He taught her to move quietly through snow, to recognize animal tracks, to find food when the land seemed to offer none. He showed her how to use her limited vision to her advantage, training her to rely more on her hearing, her sense of smell, the feel of the ground beneath her feet. Wichapi continued her own form of teaching, showing Ellie which plants could heal, which could harm, which could be used for dye or cordage. The old woman's hands guided hers in weaving, in preparing hides, in 100 small tasks that transformed mere survival into living. The poultice for her eye became a nightly ritual, always accompanied by songs that Ellie gradually learned to hum along with. Her blind eye did not regain its sight, but something else was happening. A sharpening of her other senses, a deeper awareness of the world around her. One evening, as Maka returned from checking his traps, he found Ellie sitting outside the lodge, her face turned to the setting sun. "Storm coming," she said without looking at him. "Big one. Tomorrow, maybe." Maka raised an eyebrow. "How you know?" Ellie shrugged. "The birds are quiet, the air feels heavier, and there's a smell like metal and wet stone." A slow smile spread across Maka's face. "You learn good," he said, offering her a hand up. "Now come. Grandmother wants to show you something." Inside the lodge, Wichapi sat surrounded by what appeared to be painting supplies. Small pots of pigment, brushes made from animal hair, a stretched hide serving as canvas. She beckoned Ellie closer, speaking rapidly to Maka. "Grandmother says it's time you learn our stories," he translated. "Not just how to survive, but why we survive." That night, as the impending storm gathered strength beyond the lodge walls, Wichapi began painting symbols on the hide, explaining each one through Maka. Creation stories, tales of heroes and tricksters, the history of their people, all captured in images that seemed simple at first glance, but revealed deeper meanings as Wichapi elaborated. When she had finished one section, she handed the brush to Ellie. "Now you," she said, "your story." Hesitantly, Ellie began to paint. She depicted her journey, the wagon train, her abandonment, her desperate trek north. She painted Maka finding her, the storm, Wichapi's healing. With each image, the knot of pain in her chest loosened slightly, the memories becoming less sharp-edged as they took form outside herself. When she finished, Wichapi nodded approvingly, then pointed to the blank space that remained. "Future," she said simply. The storm Ellie had predicted arrived with a vengeance, confining everyone to their lodges for 3 days. When it finally passed, the world had been transformed. Snow drifts higher than a man's head, trees bowed under the weight of ice, the very shape of the landscape altered. It was during this time that Ellie noticed a change in how the village treated her. No longer was she viewed with suspicion or merely tolerated. People began to seek her out, asking her opinion on weather changes, bringing small ailments for her to examine alongside Wichapi. Her maps became valued resources, copied onto hide for hunting parties to carry. She had found a place, unexpected and yet somehow fitting. As winter began to loosen its grip, the first signs of spring appearing. In patches of bare ground and swelling buds on the trees, Maka announced it was time for her first real hunt. "Big medicine," he said, gesturing to her wrapped eye. "Now we see if grandmother's work makes you strong hunter." Wichapi prepared a special mixture different from the usual poultice, darker with a strong, earthy scent. She applied it to Ellie's eye, then unwrapped the bandages completely for the first time in months. Ellie blinked in the sudden light. Her blind eye still could not see, but it no longer felt dead to her. Instead, there was a curious tingling sensation, a warmth that spread from it through the rest of her face. "What is this?" she asked, touching the skin around her eye, which felt unusually sensitive. Wichapi smiled, speaking to Maka. "Grandmother says you hunt in shadows now," he translated. "When light fades, you will see what others cannot." Ellie didn't understand, but she nodded respectfully. Wichapi had earned her trust over the long winter months. They set out at midday, Maka leading the way through melting snowdrifts and muddy patches of ground. He had given Ellie a bow of her own, smaller than his, but perfectly balanced for her strength and reach. They had practiced for weeks with it, her accuracy improving steadily under his patient instruction. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, they reached a small clearing surrounded by pine trees. Maka pointed to fresh tracks in the mud, deer heading south toward water. "We wait," he whispered, guiding her to a position downwind from the expected path of the deer. They come when sun touches trees. They settled in to wait, silent and motionless, despite the cold seeping through their leggings from the damp ground. As the sun lowered, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ellie noticed something strange happening with her vision. The blind eye, while still unable to see shapes or details, began to detect differences in light and shadow that her good eye missed. It was as if a new awareness was opening within her. Not true sight, but something almost more valuable. The deepening twilight. She could sense movement before it registered visually, could feel the subtle shifts in the air currents around them. "Maka," she whispered. "There." She pointed to a spot between two fallen logs, where nothing was visible to normal sight. He frowned, about to question her, when a young buck stepped precisely into the place she had indicated, materializing from the shadows as if conjured by her words. Maka's eyes widened slightly, but he gave no other indication of surprise. He nodded for her to take the shot. Ellie rose to her knees, drawing the bow with practiced ease. The strange dual awareness guided her aim. Her seeing eye focused on the buck's form, her blind eye somehow sensing its movement, its intent, the tension in its muscles as it paused to listen for danger. The arrow flew true, striking the deer just behind the shoulder. It bounded forward a few steps, then collapsed, its death quick and clean. Maka's hand came to rest on her shoulder, squeezing once in silent approval. "Good hunt," he said simply. When they returned to the village, the buck slung between them on a carrying pole, Wichapi was waiting. She examined Ellie's eye, now uncovered, and nodded with satisfaction. "Shadow hunter," she proclaimed, loud enough for others nearby to hear. "Seas between worlds." Word spread quickly through the village. That night, a celebration was held, with Ellie's kill providing the central feast. Songs were sung, stories told, and Ellie found herself welcomed into the circle, not as an outsider, but as one who had earned her place. As the weeks passed and spring strengthened its hold on the land, Ellie's unique hunting ability became well known. In the half-light of dawn and dusk, she could track game that others lost in the shadows, could anticipate movements before they occurred. Wichapi explained through Maka that her blindness had been transformed from weakness into strength, that in losing ordinary sight, she had gained something deeper. It was during a hunting trip farther afield than usual that Ellie's new life collided with her old one. She and Maka had tracked a small herd of elk to a valley Ellie had never visited before. As they crested a ridge overlooking the grazing animals, Maka suddenly pulled her down into the cover of a rocky outcropping. "What?" she began, but he pressed a finger to his lips, pointing toward the far end of the valley. Riders, white men, soldiers, judging by their uniform appearance, making camp beside a small creek. "We go back," Maka whispered. "Tell others." But as they began their careful retreat, a shout went up from below. They had been spotted. "Run," Maka urged, pushing. her toward the thicker forest to the east. I lead them away. No! Ellie grabbed his arm. We stay together! Before he could argue, riders appeared on both sides, cutting off their escape routes. Within moments, they were surrounded by mounted soldiers, rifles trained on them. A man with lieutenant's bars on his uniform urged his horse forward. "Well, what do we have here?" he drawled, his southern accent thick despite the years since the war's end. "A savage and... wait." He leaned forward, studying Ellie's face. "You're white." Ellie straightened, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I am Eleanor Morgan," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "And this is my friend, Maka." The lieutenant's eyes narrowed. "Morgan? Any relation to Thomas Morgan, the cartographer?" Surprise flashed through her. "He was my father." A murmur went through the soldiers. The lieutenant dismounted, approaching, cautiously, but with less hostility than before. "Your father's maps were the reason we were sent out here," he explained. "The territorial governor wants to complete his survey work. When we heard he died, we started asking after his daughter." He eyed her deerskin clothing, the bow in her hand, the uncovered blind eye that no longer brought her shame. "Though, I have to say, you're not exactly what we expected to find." Behind him, another man pushed his way forward, older, with a grizzled beard and eyes like chips of ice. William Thornton, the wagon master who had left her to die. "It's her all right," he confirmed, his gaze sliding over her with distaste. "Gone native, looks like." Anger flared in Ellie's chest, hot and sudden. "You abandoned me," she said, each word precise and cutting. "Left me to die when my father was barely cold in his grave." Thornton shrugged, unrepentant. "Half-blind girl with no family? Would have been kinder to shoot you like a lame horse." The lieutenant looked uncomfortable. "Be that as it may, Miss Morgan, we've been sent to bring you back. Your father's work was important to the territory's development. His notes, his unfinished maps, they belong to the government now." "Those maps are mine," Ellie said firmly, "and I'm not going anywhere." Maka shifted slightly beside her, his hand moving subtly toward the knife at his belt. The soldiers noticed, their rifles rising in response. "Don't be foolish, girl," Thornton snapped. "You're coming with us, one way or another. These savages killed a settlement just last month. You're lucky they didn't do the same to you." "Lies," Maka said, his English clear enough for all to hear. "No killing. We trade with white men, not fight." The lieutenant raised a hand, silencing Thornton before he could respond. "Miss Morgan, I have orders to retrieve you and your father's. Cartographic work. I'd prefer to do this peacefully." Ellie's mind raced. She could see the growing tension in the soldiers' postures, the way Maka was preparing himself for a fight he couldn't possibly win. Behind them, twilight was approaching, her time of power when her shadow sight was strongest. "My father's maps are in the village," she said slowly. "I'll take you there, but only you, Lieutenant. Your men stay here." "Not a chance," Thornton objected. "It's a trap." "If I wanted you dead," Ellie said coolly, "you would never have seen us on that ridge." The lieutenant studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll come with you. Corporal Davis will accompany us. The rest stay here." "And him?" Thornton jerked his head toward Maka. "He comes with us," Ellie insisted. "He's my guide, my teacher." The journey back to the village was tense, conducted in near silence as dusk settled over the land. As the shadows lengthened, Ellie's special sight strengthened. She could sense the lieutenant's unease, the corporal's finger never straying far from his trigger, Thornton's barely contained hostility. They crested the final ridge overlooking Hidden Springs, just as the last light faded from the sky. Below them, the village glowed with cook fires, the silhouettes of people moving between lodges, visible in the gathering darkness. "There," Ellie said, pointing. "That's where I live now." "With them?" Thornton's disgust was palpable. "You choose these people who saved me?" Ellie cut him off. People who saw value in me despite my blindness? Yes. The lieutenant cleared his throat. Miss Morgan, I sympathize with your situation, but my orders stand. You and your father's work are coming with us? And if I refuse? His expression hardened. Then I return with my full complement of men at dawn. A threat, thinly veiled but clear. Ellie exchanged a glance with Maka, whose face remained impassive, but whose eyes conveyed understanding. They had discussed this possibility during the long winter nights. What would happen if white authorities came looking for her or her father's maps? Wait here, she said finally. I'll bring what you want. The lieutenant nodded, gesturing for the corporal to dismount and stand guard, while Thornton remained on his horse, scowling. Ellie and Maka descended toward the village, moving swiftly through the darkness. As soon as they were out of earshot, Maka spoke urgently. I am Eleanor Morgan, daughter of Thomas Morgan, mapmaker and shadow hunter of the Lakota people. I offer an alliance, my maps, my knowledge, my skills as a translator between our worlds. But I will not be taken by force. The lieutenant's gaze traveled from her face, half in shadow, the blind eye somehow more unsettling in the darkness, to the silent warriors behind her, to the map still partially unfurled in her hand. And if I refuse this alliance, Ellie's smile was thin, then you return to your superiors empty-handed, with nothing to show for your expedition except one wounded man and a story they may not believe. For what felt like an eternity. No. Unmoved, Thornton's pained groans had subsided to labored breathing. The corporal's rifle barrel wavered slightly in his grip. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird called, once, twice, then silence. Finally, the lieutenant nodded just once. I'll take your proposal to my commanding officer. We'll establish formal communications. He glanced at Thornton. And I'll take him with us. Wise choice, Ellie said, lowering her bow slightly. Maka will escort you back to your camp. When you're ready to negotiate properly, send a single rider with a white flag. We'll meet on neutral ground. As the lieutenant and corporal helped Thornton onto his horse, Maka stepped forward. He spoke quietly to Ellie in Lakota, then turned to the lieutenant. She is under protection of Maka, son of Running Elk, grandson of Chief White Bear. He said formally, remember this when you speak to your chief. The soldiers departed, Maka and two other warriors shadowing them to ensure they returned directly to their camp. Ellie watched until they disappeared into the darkness, the tension in her body only then beginning to ease. When she returned to the village, Wichapi was waiting. The old woman's face was grave, but her eyes shone with something like pride. You bargained well, she said in halting English, like true Lakota. That night, a council was held. The village elders gathered in the largest lodge, sitting in a circle around the central fire. Ellie was invited to join them, an honor rarely granted to one so young, and never before to an outsider. Through Maka's translation and her own growing knowledge of the language, Ellie explained what had happened, what she had offered, and what she believed would come next. The soldiers will return, she concluded. Not these few, but many. It's the way of the white man to take what they want, to push ever westward. But perhaps with my help, we can guide that tide. Choose which lands to share, which to hold sacred. Use their need for maps as leverage for peace. An elder with a deeply lined face and a single eagle feather in his hair spoke at length. Maka translated carefully. Two Hawks says your words have wisdom, but also danger. White men make promises with their mouths that their hearts do not keep. How can we trust any bargain? Ellie nodded, acknowledging the concern. You can't, not fully, neither can I. But I know their laws, their ways of thinking. And now I know, yours as well. I stand between worlds, as Wichapi says. Perhaps that is where I was always meant to be. Discussion continued late into the night. Some argued for moving the village deeper into the mountains, away from the soldiers' reach. Others suggested forming alliances with neighboring tribes to present a united front. Still others favored Ellie's approach of cautious negotiation. In the end, the decision was made to wait for the lieutenant's return, to hear what offer he brought from his superiors, but to prepare for all possibilities. Hunting parties would stockpile meat, scouts would watch the soldiers' movements, and Ellie would continue making her special maps, documents that showed enough to satisfy white authorities while concealing the most sacred places. As the council dispersed, Maka walked with Ellie back to Wichapi's lodge. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like grains of sand, the air sharp with the scent of pine and wood smoke. "You fought well today," he said quietly. "Not with arrows, but with words." "I learned from you," Ellie replied. "From all of you. How to see in darkness, how to stand firm when afraid." Maka stopped, turning to face her. In the starlight, his features were softened, the usual watchfulness in his eyes replaced by something more vulnerable. "When soldiers came," he said, slowly, carefully choosing his English words, "I thought you might go with them, return to your people." Ellie shook her head. "My people are here now." The simplicity of the statement hung between them, weighted with all that had happened since that first meeting on Black Pine Ridge. Maka reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, just below her blind eye. "Shadow Hunter," he murmured, the Lakota words flowing more naturally than their English equivalents. "One who sees what others cannot." That night, as Ellie lay in her furs, listening to Wichapi's soft, rhythmic breathing, she found herself thinking of the empty space on the hide painting, the part the old woman had labeled future. For months it had remained blank, a question without answer. Now, finally, she knew what images belonged there. Spring advanced swiftly after that, the snow retreating up the mountainsides, wildflowers appearing in meadows that had been frozen only weeks before. The village hummed with activity, repairs to lodges damaged by winter storms, preparation of new hunting grounds, children released from the confines of indoor life, running wild with pent-up energy. Ellie divided her time between mapping with Maka and learning medicine from Wichapi. Her skill with the bow continued to improve, especially in the transitional hours of dawn and dusk when her shadow sight was strongest. She had become something neither fully white nor fully Lakota, something new, a bridge between worlds. A week after the confrontation with the lieutenant, scouts reported a single rider approaching from the east, a white flag visible even at a distance. Makar and Ellie rode out to meet him, accompanied by two other warriors whose judgment was respected in the village. The rider was the corporal who had been with the lieutenant that night. He seemed nervous, eyes darting frequently to the warriors, blanking Ellie, but his voice remained steady as he delivered his message. "Lieutenant Crawford presents his compliments to Miss Morgan and the leaders of the Lakota village," he recited formally. "He wishes to inform you that our commanding officer, Major Harland, is intrigued by the proposal for cooperation and mapping services. The Major requests a formal meeting 3 days from now at the confluence of Wolf Creek and the Little Missouri." Ellie exchanged a glance with Maka. The location suggested was relatively neutral, far enough from the village to protect their privacy, but open ground where an ambush would be difficult. "Tell Lieutenant Crawford we accept," she replied. "I will come with 3 representatives from the village. The Major should bring no more than 3 men as well. This is to be a peaceful negotiation." The corporal nodded, clearly relieved that his mission had gone smoothly. "The Major also instructed me to inform you that William Thornton has been relieved of his position with the Army Scouts. His perspective on Indian affairs was deemed counterproductive." A diplomatic way of saying the wagon master's bloodthirsty attitude had become a liability. Ellie nodded, satisfied, one less threat to worry about. As the corporal turned his horse to leave, Ellie called after him. One more thing. Tell the Major to bring my father's original notes and maps, the ones he had with him when he died. If we're to continue his work, I'll need them." The 3 days before the meeting passed quickly, filled with preparation and planning. Ellie worked with the village's best hunters to learn everything they could about the meeting site. Approaches, sight lines, escape routes if needed. With Wichapi's help, she prepared special medicine for her eye, wanting her shadow sight at full strength. The night before the meeting, unable to sleep, Ellie slipped out of the lodge and made her way to the edge of the village. The moon was nearly full, bathing the landscape in silver light that her good eye could see clearly, while her shadow sight detected the movement of night creatures in the underbrush. A fox slipping between rocks, an owl gliding silently overhead. She wasn't surprised when Maka found her there. He moved so quietly that most would never have heard his approach, but Ellie's senses had sharpened during her months with the Lakota. She felt his presence before she saw him, a warmth at her, back like the first touch of morning sun. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, settling beside her on a fallen log. "Too much thinking," she admitted. "Tomorrow changes everything, for me, for the village." Maka was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "Do you remember," he finally said, "when I found you on the ridge? Half dead, but still fighting?" Ellie nodded. How could she forget? It seemed both yesterday and a lifetime ago. "I almost left you there," he continued, his voice low. "Easier, safer for my people." The admission didn't shock her. She had guessed as much. From the beginning, the hesitation in his posture that day, the long assessment before he decided to help. "Why didn't you?" she asked. Though she thought she knew the answer now, Maka turned to look at her, his dark eyes reflecting the moonlight. "I saw something in you. Not white, not Lakota. Something between, like message from spirits." He touched his chest. "I felt it here." Ellie understood. Her place between worlds, the very quality that had made her an outcast among the settlers, was what had saved her life. What now gave her value to both sides. "Tomorrow," she said, "I'm going to try to protect your people, your way of life. I don't know if I'll succeed." Maka's hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers warm against her skin. "We will succeed," he corrected. "Together." The meeting place was a wide, flat area where 2 waterways merged, creating a natural boundary. Ellie arrived with Maka, Spotted Wolf, and a respected elder named Black Kettle. They made camp on the north side of the confluence, building a small fire and erecting a simple shelter of hides stretched over branches. From their position, they could see the army detachment arrive on the southern bank. 4 men on horseback, one carrying a white flag, another leading a pack mule loaded with what appeared to be document cases and surveying equipment. Ellie recognized the lieutenant immediately. Beside him rode an older man with a salt and pepper beard and the insignia of a major. Harland, presumably. The other 2 were enlisted men, one the corporal from before, the other unfamiliar. Using flat-bottom boats hidden earlier by Lakota scouts, Ellie and her companions crossed to a small island in the middle of the confluence. The soldiers did the same from their side, leaving their weapons behind as agreed, though Ellie noted that the major kept a pistol at his hip. She had expected no less, and had her own knife concealed in her boot. "Miss Morgan," the major said, as they approached each other on the neutral ground of the island. "You're not what I expected." Ellie stood tall, dressed in a blend of Lakota and frontier clothing, deerskin leggings and vest over a cotton shirt that had once belonged to her father, her hair braided in the Lakota style, but tied with a ribbon her mother had given her years ago. Her blind eye was uncovered, the skin around it marked with the symbols Wichapi had painted that morning: protection, wisdom, vision. "Major Harland," she replied with a slight nod. "Let me introduce Maka, son of Running Elk, Spotted." Wolf, master hunter, and Black Kettle, elder and keeper of stories. The formalities observed, they settled around a small fire built in the center of the island. The major produced a flask and offered it around, a gesture of goodwill that Ellie and Maka accepted with small sips, while the elders declined. "I've reviewed your father's work," Harlan began, motioning for the corporal to open one of the document cases. "Remarkable cartography. Detailed, accurate, invaluable for the territory's development." Ellie's heart tightened at the sight of her father's familiar handwriting, the careful lines of his maps. "Those belong to me," she said quietly. "My inheritance." Harlan's expression was sympathetic but firm. "The army commissioned those surveys, Miss Morgan. Legally, they're government property." Before she could protest, he raised a hand. "However, I'm authorized to offer you a position as official cartographer for this region, working under army protection, but with considerable autonomy." Ellie glanced at Maka, whose face revealed nothing to those who didn't know him well, but she could read the tension in the set of his shoulders, the slight narrowing of his eyes. "And the Lakota?" she asked. "What protection do they receive?" "Sir," Major cleared his throat. "That's a more complex matter. The government's policy toward the Indian tribes is evolving. A diplomatic way of saying that promises would be made and broken as convenience dictated." Ellie had expected this. "Then let me simplify it," she said, reaching for her own satchel. "I have created maps that combine my father's techniques with Lakota knowledge of the land. They're more detailed, more accurate than anything your surveyors could produce in years of work." She unrolled one such map on the ground between them, the same one she had shown the lieutenant, but now completed. It showed not just topography, but seasonal hunting grounds, water sources that remained viable in drought, passages through mountains that appeared impassable. Harlan couldn't hide his interest as he leaned forward to study it. "Impressive," he murmured. "And you offer these in exchange for—" "A formal agreement," Ellie said firmly. "Guaranteed Lakota hunting rights in these regions." She traced a large area with her finger. "No settlement within these boundaries for 20 years. And my continued role as liaison between your government and the Lakota people with the power to report violations directly to territorial authorities." The Black Kettle spoke then, his voice deep and measured, Maka translating his words into English. "We do not ask for what is not ours to ask. The land belongs to all people, to the animals, to the spirits. We ask only for space to live as we have always lived, to hunt, to pray, to raise our children in the old ways while learning new ones." The major listened attentively, his expression thoughtful. When Black Kettle finished, Harlan sat back, considering. "I cannot promise that settlers won't continue moving west," he said finally. "That tide cannot be stopped. But I can designate protected territories, enforce boundaries, create a buffer zone where your people can live undisturbed for a time." "For how long?" Ellie pressed. 10 years, Harlan offered, with renegotiation after that period. 15, Ellie countered. With Eleanor Morgan as the registered owner of these lands under American law, leasing usage rights to the Lakota people in perpetuity. It was a legal fiction, but one that might offer protection. If the land was privately owned rather than designated as a reservation, it would be harder for the government to simply redraw boundaries when it became convenient. Harlan's eyebrows rose. "Creative," he admitted. "I'll need approval from my superiors for such an arrangement." "Then get it," Ellie said simply. "In the meantime, I'll continue mapping the territory, but I'll retain the most valuable information until our agreement is formalized." The negotiations continued through the day and into the evening, details hammered out, compromises made on both sides. As night fell, they agreed to reconvene in 1 month's time at the same location, with written documents and proper authorities present. As they prepared to return to their respective camps for the night, the Major took Ellie aside. "Your father would be proud," he said quietly. "He always spoke of wanting to create maps that served all people, not just those in power." Ellie hadn't expected this glimpse of humanity from the army officer. "You knew him?" Harlan nodded. "We served together briefly during the war, different sides of the conflict, but we met during a prisoner exchange. Later, when I was assigned to this territory, I requested him specifically for the survey work." He paused. "He spoke of you often. His clever daughter with one sharp eye that saw more than most men with two." Something tight in Ellie's chest loosened at these words, a pain she hadn't fully acknowledged until it began to ease. "Thank you for telling me," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion beneath it. As they crossed back to the northern shore, Maka moved his boat alongside Ellie's. "The soldier chief," he said in Lakota. "He respects you. He respects what I know," Ellie corrected, "what I can provide." Maka shook his head. "No, more than that. He sees you as your father's daughter, a person of worth." It was true, Ellie realized. For the first time since her father's death, she had been treated not as a burden, not as a curiosity, but as an equal in negotiation, as someone with power of her own. When they returned to the village, Wichapi was waiting, as she always seemed to be at important moments. The old woman took one look at Ellie's face and nodded in satisfaction. "You found your path," she said in Lakota, the words now familiar to Ellie. "Between worlds, making new way." That night, as the village gathered to hear the outcome of the negotiations, Ellie stood beside Maka and the elders, no longer apart, no longer merely tolerated. She belonged here now, in this place that had once been alien to her, yet she also maintained connections to the world she had come from, a bridge spanning what had seemed an unbridgeable divide. When the council ended, Maka walked with her, to the edge of the village, to the same fallen log where they had sat the night before. The stars were just as bright, the air just as sweet with pine and promise. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice quiet in the darkness. Ellie looked toward the eastern horizon, where the first hint of dawn would eventually appear. "Now we wait," she said. "We prepare. We hope the Major keeps his word. And if he does not?" She turned to Maka, her expression resolute. "Then we fight, with maps, with words, with whatever weapons we need. I didn't survive being abandoned in the wilderness just to lose my new home to broken promises." Maka's smile was slow but warm, like the gradual lighting of a fire. "Shadow hunter becomes shadow warrior." "If necessary," Ellie agreed. Then, more softly, "But I hope it won't come to that. I've seen enough fighting, enough loss." They sat in companionable silence as the night deepened around them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, maps to create, boundaries to define, a delicate balance to maintain between two worlds that viewed each other with suspicion and fear. But tonight, in this moment, there was peace. Ellie thought of the blank space on Wichapi's hide painting, the future that had once seemed so uncertain. She knew now what images belonged there, not just her own path forward, but a new way for others to follow. A way between worlds, where differences became strengths rather than divisions. The weeks that followed were filled with intense work. Ellie and Maka traveled widely, charting territories that would be included in their proposed agreement with the army. They mapped hunting grounds and sacred sites, water sources and defensible positions, knowledge that would be shared or withheld strategically during future negotiations. Wichapi continued Ellie's education in Lakota medicine and spirituality, teaching her to prepare remedies from plants that grew in the mountains and plains, showing her how to read the messages in cloud formations and animal behavior. The old, Woman's health had begun to decline slightly with the change of seasons, making these lessons more urgent, more precious. In the evenings, Black Kettle and other elders shared stories of the tribe's history, tales of great hunts and battles, of vision quests and spirit journeys, of times long past when the Lakota had roamed freely across lands that now bore the marks of white settlement. Ellie recorded these stories alongside her maps, creating a living document of a culture fighting to survive in a changing world. As the date for their second meeting with Major Harland approached, tension in the village increased. Scouts reported increased army patrols in the region, though none came close to Hidden Springs. A band of settlers had been seen 5 days' ride to the east, wagon trains pushing ever westward despite the early season. The morning before they were to depart for the confluence, Ellie woke before dawn, drawn outside by some instinct she couldn't name. The air was unusually still, the pre-dawn darkness deeper than normal. She made her way to the edge of the village, where a small rise offered a view of the eastern horizon. As she reached the top of the rise, she sensed rather than heard someone approach. Her shadow sight, now finely tuned, identified Wichapi before the old woman spoke. "You feel it," Wichapi said. Not a question, but a statement. Ellie nodded. "Something's coming. Something important." Wichapi settled beside her on a flat rock, her movements slower than they had been months before, but still graceful in their economy. "Today you choose," she said, her English carefully formed, "for all people." Before Ellie could ask what she meant, the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. Not the usual golden glow, but a deep, burning red that spread across the sky like spilled blood. A warning, or perhaps a blessing. With Lakota omens, Ellie had learned the distinction often depended on how one responded to them. They watched in silence as the crimson light gradually shifted to orange, then yellow, the sun emerging to cast long shadows across the landscape. Wichapi reached into the small medicine pouch she always carried, withdrawing a mixture of herbs and powdered minerals. "For your eye," she said, pressing it into Ellie's palm. "Special medicine for seeing truth behind lies." Ellie accepted it with appropriate solemnity. Wichapi's medicines were never given lightly, especially those meant for heightening perception. When they returned to the village, Marka was already preparing for the journey, checking his weapons, packing provisions. He looked up as they approached, his expression questioning when he saw the medicine in Ellie's hand. "Grandmother thinks we'll need help seeing clearly today," Ellie explained, tucking the mixture into her own medicine pouch. Marka nodded, unsurprised. Like most Lakota, he trusted Wichapi's instincts implicitly. "Black Kettle had dream last night," he said. "White soldiers coming from east, many guns, but also white flag, talking papers. War and peace arriving together. It matched the blood-red dawn, the tension Ellie had felt upon waking. Today would indeed be a day of choices, it seemed." They departed mid-morning, a larger party than before. Ellie, Marka, Black Kettle, and Spotted Wolf as the primary negotiators, but accompanied by 6 warriors who would remain hidden in the surrounding hills as precaution. The increased security had been Marka's insistence, and after the ominous signs that morning, Ellie didn't argue. They arrived at the confluence before midday, making camp on the northern shore as before. There was no sign yet of the army detachment, but Ellie hadn't expected them until afternoon at earliest. She used the time to review her maps one final time, ensuring that what she planned to share would be valuable enough to secure their agreement, while what she withheld would maintain their bargaining position for future negotiations. It was Spotted Wolf who first noticed the dust on the southern horizon, not the small cloud that would indicate the expected party of officers, but a larger disturbance suggesting many riders moving at speed. He alerted the others with a low whistle, pointing toward the approaching column. Through her spyglass, one of her father's possessions she had managed to keep, Ellie counted at least 20 mounted soldiers with what appeared to be a supply wagon behind them, far more than the small delegation they had agreed upon. "Something's changed," she said, lowering the glass. "Marker, signal the scouts to be ready." As the army column drew closer, Ellie could make out Major Harland at its head alongside Lieutenant Crawford. Their expressions, even at this distance, appeared grim rather than triumphant. Not the bearing of men coming to announce they had secured approval for the agreement. Marker stood at her shoulder, his body tense as a drawn bowstring. "We should go," he said quietly. "Return to village. Prepare defenses." Ellie hesitated. Running now might trigger the very conflict they hoped to avoid. And something in Harland's demeanor suggested he wasn't leading a war party, despite the show of force. "No," she decided, "we meet them as planned, but be ready." They crossed to the island in the middle of the confluence, this time all 4 of them together, rather than leaving Spotted Wolf on the shore, as they had previously. The army party arrived at the southern bank shortly after, Harland and 3 others dismounting, while the rest formed a perimeter around their position. As the officers crossed to the island in their flat-bottomed boat, Ellie applied Wichapi's medicine to her blind eye, feeling the familiar tingling sensation as it took effect. Her shadow sight sharpened instantly, the edges of her perception extending beyond normal limits. She could sense the tension in the approaching men, the weight of whatever news they carried. "Miss Morgan," Harland greeted her, his voice formal but not hostile. "I apologize for the change in arrangements. Circumstances have evolved since our last meeting." Ellie nodded once, waiting. Beside her, Marker and the others remained silent, watching. The major pulled a folded document from inside his coat. "I've received instructions from territorial authorities regarding our proposed agreement." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "They are willing to recognize certain hunting rights and establish a buffer zone between settlements and Lakota territories." Hope flickered briefly, but Ellie's enhanced perception caught the reluctance in Harland's posture, the regret in his eyes. "But," she prompted, "but they reject the proposal for private ownership of the lands in question. All territories west of the Mississippi are to be brought under direct federal control, with tribal reservations established under government supervision. The familiar pattern, promises made and conditions attached, freedom offered with one hand while control was tightened with the other. Ellie had expected this, or something like it, yet disappointment still burned in her chest. "What changed?" she asked. "You seemed confident our arrangement would be approved." Harland's gaze flickered to the lieutenant, then back to Ellie. "There was an incident," he said heavily. "A settler family killed 30 miles east of here. The territorial governor is under pressure to take a harder line with all native tribes in the region." "Not Lakota," Marker said immediately. "We have not attacked settlers." "I believe you," Harland said, surprising them with his directness. "But fear doesn't distinguish between tribes. All the public knows is that Indians killed white settlers, and they demand protection." Ellie understood the political realities at play. A scared populace, an ambitious governor, an army caught between maintaining peace and satisfying its civilian masters. She had lived in both worlds long enough to see how fear drove decisions more often than reason. "What do you propose then?" she asked, keeping her voice level, despite the sick feeling in her stomach. Harland unfolded the document fully, revealing a map with clearly marked boundaries. "The governor authorizes me to establish a reservation here." He indicated an area perhaps a third the size of what they had negotiated for. The Lakota would be guaranteed protection within these boundaries, with regulated hunting rights in this. Additional territory during specific seasons. Black Kettle studied the map, his weathered face impassive but his eyes troubled. He spoke in Lakota, his words measured and dignified. Maka translated for the officers. Elder Black Kettle says, "This land is too small for our people to live as they have always lived. The hunting grounds shown here would not support our village through one winter, let alone many years." Harlan's expression suggested he agreed with this assessment, though he couldn't say so openly. "These are the terms I'm authorized to offer," he said. "I can recommend adjustments to the boundaries, but the basic framework is fixed." Ellie felt a surge of frustration, tempered by the knowledge that the Major was likely doing the best he could within his constraints. She glanced at Maka, seeing the same calculation in his eyes, weighing bad options against worse ones, looking for a path forward that preserved their people's way of life. "We need time to consider this," she said finally, "and to consult with the other elders." Harlan nodded, seeming relieved that she hadn't rejected the offer outright. "Of course, but I should warn you, the governor has authorized military action to relocate uncooperative tribes to designated reservations. I'd prefer to avoid that outcome." A threat wrapped in concern. Ellie had expected no less, but the reality of their situation struck her anew. The tide of settlement couldn't be stopped, only navigated with skill and foresight and compromise. As they prepared to conclude this initial meeting, Lieutenant Crawford approached Ellie, while the Major conferred with Black Kettle through Maka's translation. "There's something else you should know," he said quietly, keeping his voice low. Enough that only Ellie could hear. "William Thornton is back in the territory, no longer with the army, but leading a group of civilian scouts. He's been spreading stories about you. Unpleasant ones. The wagon master who had abandoned her, who had tried to shoot her during their last encounter. Of course he would return, carrying grudges and seeking revenge." "What kind of stories?" Ellie asked, though she could guess. "That you've been bewitched by savage magic, that your blind eye allows them to control your mind." Crawford looked embarrassed to even repeat such nonsense. "Most dismiss it as the ravings of a bitter man, but in the current climate, such tales could be dangerous, not just to her, but to the Lakota who had taken her in. Fear made people believe absurdities, especially when those beliefs justified actions they already wanted to take." "Thank you for the warning," Ellie said, genuine gratitude in her voice. Whatever his personal feelings about Indians, the lieutenant at least seemed to respect her. As they returned to their respective shores, Ellie's mind worked furiously, calculating options, searching for leverage points, ways to improve their position before the final negotiation. The medicine in her eye throbbed slightly, Wichapi's gift sharpening not just her perception, but her thinking as well. By the time they reached their camp, she had the beginnings of a plan. Risky, potentially dangerous, but offering better prospects than simple acceptance of the governor's terms. She gathered Maka, Black Kettle, and Spotted Wolf in their shelter, speaking in a mix of English and Lakota as she outlined her thoughts. "The governor fears an Indian uprising," she explained. "That fear is driving these restrictive terms. But what if we could demonstrate that the Lakota are not the threat they imagine? That cooperation benefits both sides more than conflict?" Black Kettle's expression was thoughtful. "How do we show this?" "The incident that changed the governor's mind. The killed settlers," Ellie said. "What if we could prove it wasn't the Lakota? What if we could find the real culprits?" Maka frowned. "Many tribes in these lands. Crow, Blackfoot, Cheyenne, some raid settlers. Or it could be white men," Spotted Wolf added in Lakota. "Thieves who blame Indians for their crimes." It was a common enough occurrence. Outlaws attacking isolated homesteads, leaving behind signs suggesting Indian raiders to divert suspicion. The army knew this happened, but often found it politically expedient to accept the Indian blame narrative. "Either way," Ellie continued, "if we can find evidence of who really attacked those settlers, we gain leverage. The governor needs someone to blame. Let's make sure it's the right someone." Black Kettle spoke at length, his deep voice resonant with concern. When he finished, Maka translated, "Elder says this is dangerous path. If we find real killers, they will not surrender quietly. If they are white men, army may not want truth." "Known," Ellie nodded, acknowledging the risks. "That's why we need Major Harland. He's a reasonable man, and I believe he wants justice, not just convenient solutions. If we can bring him evidence, he might help us present it to the governor in a way that can't be ignored." They debated long into the evening, weighing options, considering risks. In the end, they decided on a course of action. Mahka and Ellie would investigate the site of the killings, while Spotted Wolf returned to the village to prepare the people for possible relocation if negotiations failed. Black Kettle would remain at the confluence, maintaining diplomatic contact with the army officers. "We'll need 3 days," Ellie told the elder. "Tell Major Harland we're considering his offer, and we'll return with questions about specifics. That should buy us time without raising suspicion." As dusk fell, she applied more of Wichapi's medicine to her eye, preparing for what might be their most challenging task yet. The tingling sensation spread across her face, down her neck, a warmth that seemed to flow through her entire body. Her shadow sight extended further than ever before, revealing details in the gathering darkness that would have been invisible to normal vision. "You see well tonight," Maka observed as they prepared to leave, gathering only essential supplies. "For speed and stealth. Wichapi's medicine is strong," Ellie agreed. She knew we would need it. They traveled through the night, following game trails and shallow stream beds to avoid leaving obvious tracks. Maka moved like a shadow himself, his knowledge of the terrain allowing them to make good time despite the darkness. Ellie kept pace, her enhanced perception helping her navigate obstacles that would have slowed her months before. By dawn, they had covered nearly 20 miles, reaching a ridge that overlooked the eastern plains. They rested briefly, eating dried meat and sipping water sparingly from their canteens. "The settlement should be beyond those hills," Maka said, pointing toward a distant line of trees. "Another half-day's journey." Ellie studied the terrain through her father's spyglass. "We'll need to be careful when we get closer. If the army's investigating, there might be patrols." They continued at a more moderate pace as the sun climbed higher, using what cover the landscape provided. Stands of pine, dry creek beds, rocky outcroppings. As they neared the location of the attack, they began to see signs of increased activity. Horse tracks, broken branches, discarded food scraps left by soldiers or investigators. It was mid-afternoon when they finally sighted the remains of the homestead from a concealed position on a wooded hillside. The small cabin stood intact, but the barn had been partially burned, its charred timbers stark against the surrounding greenery. There was no sign of current occupation, no smoke from the chimney, no animals in the crude corral, no laundry hanging to dry. "Army already finished investigation," Maka observed. "Good for us." They waited until dusk before approaching closer, using the deepening shadows to conceal their movement. Ellie's shadow sight grew stronger as the light faded, revealing details that would escape normal vision. Faint footprints in packed earth, broken twigs indicating someone's passage, the lingering scent of smoke and something darker beneath it. The cabin door hung partially open, swinging slightly in the evening breeze. Maka approached first, bow ready, moving with the silent grace of a lifetime hunter. Ellie followed, knife in hand, her senses alert for any sign of danger. Inside, the cabin told its grim story. Overturned furniture, shattered crockery, dark stains on the rough-hewn floorboards that could only be blood. Someone had made a cursory attempt to organize the chaos, likely army investigators cataloging the scene before removing the bodies. 4 people died here, Maka said quietly, examining the patterns of disruption. Man, woman, 2 children. Ellie nodded, her stomach tight with the knowledge of what had happened in this small, humble space. She had never met the family who had lived here, but she felt a connection to them nonetheless. Settlers like those she had traveled with, seeking a new beginning in unforgiving lands. "Look for anything unusual," she said, forcing herself to focus on their purpose. Something the army might have missed. They searched methodically, Maka taking the cabin's main room, while Ellie examined the single small bedroom. The family's possessions were modest: rough furniture, a few books, homemade quilts now stained and torn. Nothing of significant value, which contradicted the theory of simple robbery. In the bedroom, Ellie's attention was drawn to a small trunk pushed partially under the bed. It had been forced open, its contents strewn about, but some items remained inside: a woman's hair combs, a child's wooden toy, letters tied with faded ribbon. Carefully, she removed the letters, feeling a pang of guilt at this invasion of privacy, even as she reminded herself of their purpose. The top envelope bore an official seal she recognized: the Territorial Governor's Office. That was unusual indeed for a simple farming family. She opened it, scanning the contents quickly by the fading light. It was addressed to Edwin Miller, presumably the homestead's owner, and signed by the governor himself. The language was formal but clear, thanking Miller for his confidential service and assuring him that his observations on tribal movements will be valuable in upcoming negotiations. A spy. The settler had been reporting on Indian activities to the governor's office. "Maka," she called softly, "I found something." He appeared in the doorway, his expression questioning. Ellie handed him the letter, watching his face darken as she translated the key passages. "This is why they died," he said grimly. "Not random attack. Someone knew what this man was doing." But who? If local tribes had discovered Miller's activities, they might well have taken violent revenge. Or if other settlers had learned of his role, they might have feared he was sharing information about their activities as well. The letter created more questions than answers. They continued searching as darkness fell completely, relying now on Ellie's shadow sight to guide them. In the cabin's small root cellar, accessible through a trapdoor in the kitchen area, Maka discovered a hidden compartment beneath a false floor. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with meticulous notes in a cramped hand. They brought it above ground, using the last embers of the fireplace to provide enough light for Ellie to read. The journal contained dated entries spanning the past 6 months, detailed observations of Indian movements, hunting parties, trading activities. Miller had been thorough in his surveillance, mapping patterns that would be invaluable to someone planning military operations against the tribes. But the final entries took a different tone. Miller had begun to express doubts about his assignment, concerns about providing information that might lead to conflict rather than peace. One passage in particular caught Ellie's attention. "Thornton visited again today. Pressed for details on Lakota hunting grounds north of the ridge. When I suggested such information might be better used for establishing boundaries than planning strikes, he grew angry. Said governor needs leverage, not coddling. Beginning to wonder if my reports are being used as intended." "Thornton," Ellie breathed, a chill running through her. "William Thornton." Maka's expression hardened. "The man who left you to die, the man who shot at you, and now apparently working with the governor, collecting information on tribal territories." The implications were disturbing. If Thornton was involved in official intelligence gathering, his hatred of Indians might be influencing territorial policy. The final entry in the journal was dated just 3 days before the estimated time of the attack. T returned in foul mood, says governor growing impatient, wants action before winter sets in. When I refused to mark sacred sites on map, he threatened to report me as Indian sympathizer. Martha, frightened, wants to leave. Perhaps she is right. We'll speak to Lieutenant C about our concerns when he next passes through. Lieutenant C, almost certainly Crawford, who had seemed uncomfortable during their meeting with the major. Had Miller reached out to the lieutenant before the attack? Had Crawford known about Miller's role as an informant? "We need to take this to Major Harland," Ellie said, carefully wrapping the journal in a piece of cloth. "It doesn't prove who killed the family, but it shows there's more to the story than a simple Indian raid." As they prepared to leave the base cabin, Maka suddenly froze, his head tilting slightly as he listened. Ellie fell silent immediately, trusting his senses. A moment later she heard it too. Horses approaching, several of them, moving at a walk rather than a gallop. Not a military patrol, which would maintain a more regular pace and formation. They extinguished what remained of the fire and moved to the window, peering cautiously into the darkness. Ellie's shadow sight revealed 5 riders approaching from the east, their postures suggesting caution rather than casual travel. One rider led the group, his hat pulled low, a rifle balanced across his saddle. Even in the darkness, even at a distance, Ellie recognized his silhouette. "Thornton," she whispered. Maka's hand went to his knife. "We should go. Now." They slipped out the back door of the cabin, staying low and using what cover the sparse vegetation provided. The riders were still several hundred yards away, but closing steadily. Ellie and Maka made for the burned barn, its charred frame offering concealment as they assessed their options. "They're coming back to the scene," Ellie murmured. "Why? What are they looking for?" "Same as us," Maka suggested. "Evidence." But evidence of what? If Thornton and his men were responsible for the killings, they might be returning to ensure nothing incriminating had been overlooked. Or perhaps they were following up on some aspect of Miller's intelligence work, seeking information the family had gathered. The riders reached the cabin, dismounting and tethering their horses to a hitching post that had somehow survived the attack. Thornton gave orders, his voice carrying faintly on the night air, though the words were indistinct. 2 men entered the cabin, while the others began searching the surrounding area, lanterns casting elongated shadows across the ground. "We need to move," Maka whispered. "They will find our tracks." Ellie nodded, clutching the wrapped journal to her chest. They could not be caught with it, their only tangible evidence linking Thornton to the Miller family before the killings. They retreated deeper into the shadows, working their way toward the tree line several hundred yards from the homestead. Progress was painfully slow, each movement carefully calculated to avoid creating noise or disturbance that might alert the searchers. They had nearly reached the safety of the trees when a shout went up from the cabin. One of Thornton's men emerged, holding something aloft, something small that caught the lantern light. "Brass button," Maka breathed. "From my vest. Must have fallen when we searched." The discovery galvanized the searchers. Thornton barked orders, men spreading out in widening circles from the cabin, lanterns sweeping the ground for tracks or further evidence of intruders. "Run," Ellie urged, abandoning stealth for speed. "We need to reach the trees." They sprinted the remaining distance, Maka easily outpacing Ellie despite her months of training. The shouts behind them grew louder as their movement was spotted, followed by the sharp crack of a rifle shot. The bullet went wide, but the message was clear. Thornton's men were willing to shoot first and ask questions later. The trees provided immediate relief from exposure, but little real security. Their pursuers would follow, and in the dense woods, Thornton's superior numbers would be an advantage. They needed a plan beyond simply running. "The creek," Maka said between breaths as they pushed deeper into the forest. "Crosswater, hide tracks." Ellie nodded, conserving her breath for the effort of maintaining their pace. Her shadow sight helped her navigate the undergrowth, avoiding roots and low branches that might trip or slow her. The medicine Wichapi had given her was working at full strength now, her awareness extending outward like invisible tendrils, sensing movement and intention in the darkness. They reached the creek, little more than a shallow stream winding through the forest floor, and waded into its cold embrace. The water would mask their scent and obscure their tracks, making pursuit more difficult. They followed its course, upstream for nearly half a mile before emerging on the opposite bank, careful to step on stones and roots that wouldn't hold footprints. Behind them, distant shouts indicated their pursuers had reached the creek as well, but uncertainty had entered their search pattern. The lanterns moved erratically as Thornton's men debated which direction to follow. "They're not trackers," Ellie observed quietly. "Not like you?" Maka's expression was grim satisfaction. "City men. Play at being woodsmen." They continued moving, maintaining a steady pace now, rather than an all-out sprint. The forest grew denser, older, the trees towering overhead in a canopy that blocked even the starlight. For most, such darkness would be impenetrable, but Ellie's enhanced sight cut through it, revealing a path where others would see only obstacle. "This way," she whispered, taking the lead now. "There's a ravine ahead, a good place to hide and rest if we need to." Maka followed without question, trusting her perception as she had trusted his. The partnership they had formed went beyond words now, beyond conscious thought, a unity of purpose and understanding forged through months of shared danger and learning. The ravine was, as Ellie had sensed it, a narrow cut in the earth, perhaps 15 feet deep, its sides steep but navigable. At the bottom, a fallen tree created a natural shelter, its massive root system forming a cave-like space large enough for 2 people to hide. They settled into this temporary refuge, listening intently for sounds of pursuit. The shouts had faded, the lanterns no longer visible through the trees. Either Thornton's men had lost their trail completely or had chosen a different direction to search. "We should rest," Maka said, his voice barely audible. "Continue when safer." Ellie nodded, though anxiety made rest difficult. They had the journal, evidence that might change the course of negotiations, but they needed to get it to Major Harland before Thornton realized what they had found. And now they had been seen, their presence at the homestead confirmed. The stakes had risen significantly. They took turns keeping watch through the night, one sleeping fitfully, while the other listened for any sign of their pursuers. Ellie's shadow sight diminished somewhat as Wichapi's medicine gradually wore off, but her awareness remained heightened, attuned to the forest's rhythms in a way that would have been impossible for the Ellie who had been abandoned months ago. As dawn approached, a light rain began to fall, further obscuring any tracks they might have left. It was a gift from the spirits, Maka said, a blessing on their journey and their purpose. They set out as soon as there was enough light to navigate safely, taking a circuitous route back toward the confluence where Black Kettle waited with the army officers. The rain continued throughout the morning, a steady drizzle that soaked through their clothing but provided valuable cover from any continued search. By midday, they had put considerable distance between themselves and the homestead, following game trails that kept them under the forest canopy as much as possible. They paused briefly to eat some of their dwindling provisions and assess their position. "How far to the confluence?" Ellie asked, wringing water from her hair. Maka considered, his gaze scanning the cloud-obscured sky for directional cues. "Half day, maybe more in this weather. We must cross open ground soon." That would be the most dangerous part of their journey, leaving the protection of the forest for the exposed plains that separated them from the river confluence. If Thornton had guessed their destination, he might have men watching the approach. As if reading her thoughts, Maka added, "We wait for dark. Safer to cross when we can. See them before they see us." Ellie nodded agreement. Her shadow sight would give them advantage once night fell, allowing them to detect patrols or ambushes from a distance. Until then, they would rest and prepare, conserving strength for what might be a challenging final leg of their journey. The rain stopped mid-afternoon, clouds breaking to reveal patches of blue sky. They found a sheltered hollow beneath an overhanging rock and dried their clothing as best they could, laying the precious journal in the warmest spot to prevent water damage to its pages. As Ellie reviewed the journal's contents again, looking for any details they might have missed in their hasty initial reading, Makar fashioned additional arrows from materials at hand. Straight branches, stone chips for heads, feathers from a bird they had startled earlier. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, each motion precise and economical. "What happens," he asked without looking up from his work, "if Major believes us? If he takes journal to Governor?" It was a question Ellie had been pondering herself. Best case, the governor realizes Thornton has been manipulating information, inflaming tensions for his own purposes. The negotiations resume with better terms, acknowledging that the Lakota weren't responsible for the killings. And worst case, Ellie sighed. The governor already knows what Thornton's been doing, or doesn't care. He uses the incident regardless. Pushes forward with the restricted reservation plan. Maka nodded, as if this confirmed his own assessment. "And then we have choices to make," Ellie said carefully. "Hard ones." They fell silent, each contemplating those potential choices. Fight or flee, resist or submit. Lead their people to safety or stand ground on principle. None were easy, none without significant cost. As dusk approached, they prepared to move out, gathering their few possessions and checking weapons. Ellie applied the last of Wichapi's medicine to her eye, feeling the familiar tingling spread across her face. Her shadow sight strengthened immediately, the gathering darkness becoming as navigable as twilight to her enhanced perception. They emerged from the forest's edge as the last light faded from the western sky, stars beginning to appear overhead in the rain-washed air. Before them stretched the open plains, rolling gently toward the distant line of trees that marked the river's course. The confluence where Black Kettle waited was perhaps 5 miles away, a relatively short distance, but entirely exposed. Ellie scanned the landscape carefully, her shadow sight probing the darkness for any sign of human presence. "There," she murmured, pointing to a slight rise perhaps a mile to their left. 2 men on horseback, watching the approach to the river. Maka followed her indication, though the figures were invisible to normal sight at that distance in the darkness. Thornton's men? Most likely. They're positioned to observe anyone approaching from this direction. They conferred briefly, plotting a course that would take them wide around the watchers, using what little terrain features the plains offered for concealment: shallow depressions, isolated stands of brush, a dry creek bed that cut across their path. It would add time to their journey, but safety outweighed speed at this point. Moving in short bursts between cover points, they made steady progress across the open ground. Ellie led the way, her shadow sight identifying safe passages that Maka would have missed. Twice they froze in place as riders passed nearby, patrols circling the perimeter Thornton had established around the confluence. "He has many men," Maka observed during one such pause, his voice barely a whisper. "More than at cabin." It was concerning. Either Thornton had gathered reinforcements, or they had underestimated his resources from the beginning. Either way, reaching the army camp and Major Harland would be more difficult than anticipated. They were within a mile of the river when disaster struck. A patrol they hadn't detected approached from downwind, the horses' hooves muffled by the soft earth. Still damp from the day's rain, Ellie sensed their presence just moments before the riders crested a small rise, barely enough time to pull Maka down into the shallow depression where they had been crouching. "Down!" she hissed. "3 riders, coming fast." They pressed themselves, flat against the earth, trying to merge with the shadows cast by a sparse clump of sage. It might have been enough had the moon remained behind clouds, had the night been truly dark. But at that moment, the clouds parted, moonlight spilling across the plains in a silver flood that left few secrets unrevealed. There, movement by. The brush, One of the riders pointed directly toward their hiding place, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "Run!" Maka urged, already pushing to his feet. "To river! I slow them!" "No!" Ellie grabbed his arm. "Together! We're faster together!" There was no time to argue. The riders were bearing down on them, rifles raised. Ellie and Maka broke cover simultaneously, sprinting toward the distant tree line that marked the river's course. Behind them, shouts erupted, followed by the crack of a rifle. The bullet kicked up dirt several yards to their left, a warning shot or simply poor aim in the uncertain light. Ellie's lungs burned as she pushed herself to maintain Maka's pace. Months of training had strengthened her body beyond what she would have thought possible, but fear added an extra surge of speed, adrenaline masking the strain of their desperate flight. More shots followed, bullets whining overhead or impacting harmlessly in the earth nearby. The riders were gaining ground, inevitable given the matchup of horses against humans on open terrain. Ellie's mind raced, seeking options, escape routes, anything that might give them advantage. "The ravine," she gasped between breaths, pointing ahead where the land dipped suddenly. "Maybe 30 yards. Maka nodded, understanding. If they could reach that natural trench carved by seasonal flooding from the river, they might find cover enough to make a stand, or at least slow their pursuers. They redoubled their efforts, legs pumping, breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind them, the riders split up, two continuing direct pursuit, while the third veered off at an angle, apparently attempting to cut off their route to the ravine. 20 yards. 15. Ellie could see the ravine clearly now with her shadow sight. Deeper than she had initially thought. Its sides steep, but not impassable. If they could reach it. The flanking rider cut across their path, his horse rearing as he brought it to an abrupt halt directly in front of them. The man's face was shadowed beneath his hat brim, but his voice was unmistakable. "That's far." "Enough," William Thornton said, rifle leveled at Maka's chest. "You've led us on quite a chase, Miss Morgan." They skidded to a stop, momentum carrying them forward a few steps before they could halt completely. The other riders approached from behind, boxing them in. Escape to the ravine was cut off. "What do you want, Thornton?" Ellie demanded, fighting to control her breathing, to think clearly despite the hammering of her heart. The wagon master's laugh was dry and humorless. "Bit late to be playing innocent, isn't it? You were at the Miller place. Found something interesting, did you?" So he knew, had guessed what they'd discovered, what evidence they might have found. Ellie's hand moved imperceptibly toward her knife, but Maka gave a slight shake of his head. 3 armed men on horseback. The odds were not in their favor. "We know what you did," she said instead, stalling for time, mind racing for options. "The journal, Miller's notes about your visits, your threats." Thornton's expression hardened. Miller was a fool, thought he could play both sides, feed information to the governor while protecting his Indian friends. He spat the word like a curse. "Men like that get what they deserve." "You killed them," Ellie said, the confirmation sinking into her stomach like cold lead. "Not just Miller, his wife, his children." "I did what was necessary," Thornton replied, no remorse in his voice. "The territory needs decisive action against the savage threat, not negotiation. Miller's evidence that the tribes were peaceful would have undermined everything." As he spoke, Maka shifted slightly, repositioning himself. To the riders, it might have seemed like nervous movement, but Ellie recognized it for what it was. Preparation. He was getting ready to act, waiting for the right moment. "And what about me?" Ellie asked, maintaining Thornton's attention. "You left me to die in the wilderness. Was that necessary too?" Thornton studied her, contempt plain in his expression. "You were already half blind, useless to the wagon train, and look at you now, gone completely native, turned against your own kind." He shook his head. "Should have put a bullet in you when I had the chance." "My kind?" Ellie's voice rose with genuine anger. My kind doesn't murder innocent families to promote a false narrative about Indian attacks. My kind doesn't abandon the vulnerable to die alone in the wilderness. Enough talk, one of the other riders growled. We need to finish this and get back. The Major's asking questions about our patrols. So Harland wasn't part of whatever Thornton was planning. That was something, at least. A potential ally, if they could reach him. The journal, Thornton demanded, gesturing with his rifle. Hand it over and maybe I'll consider letting you live. Though I can't promise the same for your savage friend here. Ellie's hand went to her pack where the wrapped journal was secured. She made a show of reaching for it, movements deliberately slow, buying time as she glanced at Marker. His eyes met hers, a silent communication passing between them. Part plan, part farewell, part promise. In one fluid motion, Marker drew and loosed an arrow, the movement so swift that Thornton had no time to react. The shaft struck not the wagon master but his horse, embedding itself in the animal's flank. The creature reared in pain and surprise, throwing Thornton from the saddle as it bolted. Chaos erupted. The other riders struggled to control their own mounts as Thornton's horse careened into them. Marker grabbed Ellie's arm, pulling her toward. The ravine now suddenly accessible as their captors lost formation. Gunshots rang out behind them, wild and inaccurate amidst the confusion. Ellie felt something tug at her sleeve. A bullet passing close enough to tear the fabric, but not break. Skin. Then they were sliding down the ravine's embankment, half running, half falling in their haste to reach the relative safety of its depths. At the bottom, instead of continuing their flight, Marker pulled Ellie into the shadow of an overhanging ledge. Wait, he whispered. They follow wrong way. Sure enough, the sounds of pursuit veered off to their right, the riders assuming they would continue straight toward the river rather than taking shelter so close to the entry point. Marker's strategy bought them precious minutes as Thornton and his men thundered past their hiding place, following the ravine's course toward the confluence. We go other way, Marker said once the sounds had faded somewhat. Circle back to river farther down. Find Major without Thornton knowing. Ellie nodded, pulse still racing from their narrow escape. They set off in the opposite direction from their pursuers, following the ravine until it deepened and widened, eventually joining a small tributary that fed into the main river about a mile downstream from the confluence. The tree cover increased as they neared the water, providing better concealment. Ellie's shadow sight, still enhanced by the remnants of Wichapi's medicine, guided them through the darkest patches, identifying safe passages and warning of potential hazards. As they moved parallel to the river, now just a few hundred yards from its banks, Ellie began to detect signs of the army encampment, the faint scent of coffee and wood smoke, the occasional murmur of voices carried on the night breeze, the distant nickering of horses. We're close, she whispered, but we need to be careful. Thornton might have men watching the camp perimeter. Marker nodded, his expression grim but determined. How we find Major without others seeing? It was a valid question. Simply walking into the army camp would immediately draw attention, likely, resulting in their detention before they could speak to Harland. And if Thornton had allies among the soldiers, the journal might be taken and destroyed before the Major ever saw it. Ellie considered their options, drawing on her knowledge of military procedures from her father's interactions with army surveyors. Officers' tents are usually at the center of camp, she said slowly. Guards focus on the perimeter, watching for external threats, not internal movement. So if we reach river, Marker reasoned, come up from water to camp, maybe less guards. It's worth trying, and my shadow sight can help us avoid patrols. They made their way to the riverbank, moving with increased caution as they neared the confluence. The camp was visible now through the trees, a collection of white tents arranged in orderly rows, campfires burning low at this late hour, sentries pacing at measured intervals around the perimeter. Ellie studied the layout, noting the larger tent at the center that likely belonged to Major Harland. Between their position and that tent lay approximately 50 yards of open ground, broken only by supply wagons, hitching posts, and the smaller tents of enlisted men. "There," she murmured, pointing to a supply wagon positioned near the water's edge. "If we can reach that, we'll have cover for part of the way in." Maka assessed the route, then nodded. "After wagon, path between tents. Dark there, good shadow." They waited for the sentry nearest their position to complete his circuit, then slipped from the tree line to the water's edge, keeping low and moving quickly. The soft ground absorbed the sound of their footsteps, and the gentle lapping of the river masked any small noises they couldn't avoid. Reaching the supply wagon, they paused, catching their breath and surveying the next leg of their journey. The path Maka had identified was indeed shadowed, running between two rows of tents whose occupants appeared to be sleeping, judging by the lack of movement or light from within. "Ready?" Ellie whispered, clutching the journal securely against her chest. Maka's hand found hers briefly, a reassuring pressure in the darkness. "Ready." They moved from the wagon's shadow into the narrow corridor between tents, staying close to the canvas walls where the darkness was deepest. Ellie's shadow sight revealed sleeping forms within, soldiers unaware of the intruders passing inches from where they lay. Halfway to the central area, a tent flap opened suddenly, spilling light across their path. They froze, pressing themselves against the nearest tent wall as a soldier emerged, yawning widely. The man stood for a moment, scratching his beard absently, then turned and walked in the opposite direction, apparently heading for the latrines at the camp's edge. Once his footsteps faded, they continued on, reaching the end of the tent row and the more open central area of the camp. Here, their task became more difficult, less cover, more potential observers, greater distance to cross to reach the major's tent. A low fire burned in a pit near the command tent, its light creating a circle of illumination they would need to avoid. Two soldiers sat beside it, engaged in quiet conversation over cups of what smelled like coffee. Beyond them stood the major's tent, its entrance facing away from their position. "We go around," Maka suggested, gesturing toward a path that would take them behind the command tent, approaching from the side away from the fire and its attendant guards. Ellie nodded agreement, and they set off once more, skirting the edge of the light, keeping to the deepest shadows. The distance was short, but each step felt precariously exposed, each soft footfall thunderous to Ellie's heightened senses. They reached the back of the major's tent without incident, crouching low beside its canvas wall. Voices murmured within, Harland and someone else, their conversation too quiet to make out clearly. "How do we get his attention without alerting others?" Ellie whispered, considering their options. Maka studied the tent's construction, noting where the canvas was secured to the ground with wooden stakes. With careful movements, he loosened one such stake, creating a small gap at the bottom of the tent wall. "We go under," he suggested. Quieter than through door where guards might see. It was risky. They might be shot as intruders before they could explain themselves. But attempting to approach through the front entrance posed equal if not greater dangers. Ellie nodded agreement, clutching the journal tightly as she prepared to slip through the opening Maka had created. "I go first," he said, his expression leaving no room for argument. "If safe, I pull you through." Before she could protest, he had already begun easing his body under the tent wall, movements fluid and nearly silent despite the confined space. A moment of tense waiting, then his hand reappeared, gesturing for her to follow. Ellie took a deep breath and pushed the journal ahead of her, then wiggled through the gap, the canvas rough against her back as she squeezed underneath. Strong hands gripped her shoulders, helping pull her the rest of the way, and suddenly she was inside the command tent, blinking in the relatively bright lantern light. Major Harland stood frozen at his field desk, a half-written letter before Him, his expression a study in shock and disbelief. Lieutenant Crawford stood beside him, hand already on his sidearm, though he hadn't drawn it yet. "Miss Morgan," Harland found his voice first. "What in God's name—" "Please, Major," Ellie interrupted urgently, keeping her voice low. "We don't have much time. Thornton's men are searching for us, and what we've found puts all of us in danger." The Major's gaze flicked from Ellie to Marka, then to the journal she clutched against her chest. With a slight gesture, he indicated for Crawford to stand down. "I assume you have a good reason for this unorthodox entrance," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "We found evidence at the Miller homestead," Ellie explained, stepping forward and placing the journal on the desk. Miller was informing on tribal movements for the governor's office, but he was working with Thornton, who was pushing for conflict rather than peaceful solutions. Crawford's expression darkened. "Edwin Miller? I knew him. Decent man for a spy." "He was having second thoughts about his role," Ellie continued, opening the journal to the relevant entries. "His last entry indicates he was planning to contact you, Lieutenant, about his concerns." Harlan picked up the journal, scanning the pages with practiced efficiency. His face remained impassive, but Ellie could see the tightening of his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes as he absorbed the implications. "If this is authentic," he said finally, "it suggests Thornton deliberately mislead the governor about tribal intentions, possibly fabricated threats to justify military action." "That's not all," Ellie said grimly. "We believe Thornton himself was responsible for the Miller family's deaths, staged to look like an Indian attack. He all but admitted it when he caught us fleeing the homestead." Crawford swore softly. "We wondered about that scene, too neat somehow, like someone arranged it to tell a story." Major Harlan placed the journal carefully on his desk, his expression now grim determination. "Thornton was here earlier today, requesting additional men for what he called perimeter security. Said he had intelligence about possible hostile movement near the confluence. He's trying to prevent us from reaching you with this evidence," Ellie explained. "He has men watching all approaches to the camp." "And yet, here you are," the Major noted, a hint of grudging admiration in his voice. "Barely," Marka spoke. "For the first time since entering the tent, they follow us, not far behind." As if summoned by his words, a commotion erupted outside. Raised voices, the sound of multiple horses approaching at speed. Harland moved to the tent entrance, Crawford close behind him. Ellie and Marka exchanged worried glances. Had Thornton tracked them to the camp already? The Major returned a moment later, his expression tight. "Thornton and 3 men," he confirmed, claiming they're in pursuit of Indian raiders seen near the Miller homestead. "He knows we have the journal," Ellie said. "He'll try to discredit us, maybe claim we killed the Millers ourselves." Harland considered this, his mind visibly working through options and implications. "Lieutenant," he said finally, "escort Miss Morgan and her companion to my personal quarters. Keep them out of sight until I've dealt with Thornton." Crawford nodded, already moving toward a canvas partition that divided the command tent. He pulled it aside, revealing a smaller space. With a cot, trunk, and small table, the Major's private quarters within the larger structure. "This way quickly," he urged, "and stay silent no matter what you hear." Ellie hesitated, looking back at the journal still lying on Harlan's desk. "The evidence, I'll secure it," the Major assured her. "Now go before Thornton arrives." They had barely concealed themselves behind the partition when the tent flap opened, admitting William Thornton's bulky frame. From their hiding place, Ellie could see through a small gap in the canvas, observing without being observed. Thornton's normally ruddy face was flushed with exertion or anger, perhaps both. His clothing was dirty and disheveled, suggesting a hard ride. Behind him stood 2 rough-looking men, similarly weather-worn and armed. Major Harland, Thornton began without preamble. We've been tracking Indian raiders since sundown, spotted them near the Miller place, pursued them toward the river. Have reason to believe they might have infiltrated your camp. Harland's demeanor was perfectly professional, betraying nothing of what had transpired minutes earlier. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Thornton. My perimeter guards report no breaches, no suspicious activity. All due respect, Major, but your soldiers aren't trackers. These savages are crafty, move like ghosts when they want to. Thornton's gaze swept the tent, searching, and they had help, a white woman dressed Indian style. Might be that Morgan girl who went missing last autumn. The Major's eyebrows rose slightly. Eleanor Morgan. I was told she perished in the wilderness after being separated from her wagon train. Separated? Thornton's laugh was harsh. Is that the story now? We left her behind because she was half blind, useless. Should have died out there, but seems these Lakota found her instead, turned her against her own kind. Ellie felt Maka tense beside her. She placed a restraining hand on his arm, silently, urging patience. They needed to let this play out, trust in Harland's ability to manage the situation. And now she's helping them raid settlements? The Major's tone made it clear he found this difficult to believe. Saw her with my own eyes at the Miller place, Thornton insisted. Her and a brave, big fellow, scar across his jaw. He gestured to his own face to indicate the location. Harland made a show of consulting some papers on his desk. Deliberately, Ellie realized, moving his hand close to the journal without drawing attention to it. Interesting, he said mildly. You didn't mention Miss Morgan in your initial report about discovering the Miller attack. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Thornton's face. Wasn't sure then. Needed to confirm it was her before making such a claim. Yet you're certain now, after a brief glimpse during a night pursuit? The Major's skepticism was evident. Certain enough to accuse her of participating in the murder of an entire family? Thornton shifted his weight, suddenly less assured. She was there, he insisted, rummaging through their belongings, looking for something. Looking for what, exactly? Harland pressed. How should I know what the savages wanted? Thornton snapped, his composure cracking. Valuables, maybe, or perhaps trying to hide evidence of their brutality. The Major nodded thoughtfully, then casually picked up the journal, as if it were merely one of many documents on his desk. Evidence like this, perhaps. Edwin Miller's personal journal detailing his work as an informant and his growing concerns about how you were using his information to promote conflict rather than peace. The color drained from Thornton's face, his eyes fixed on the leather-bound book in Harland's hands. Where did you get that? He demanded, voice suddenly hoarse. It was recovered from the Miller homestead during our investigation, Harland lied smoothly. Contains some rather interesting entries about your visits, your pressure to identify sacred sites for potential military action, your threats when Miller began questioning your intentions. Thornton recovered quickly, expression hardening. Miller was soft, started sympathizing with the very savages who later butchered his family. Whatever he wrote in that book is the ramblings of a man who'd lost his nerve. Perhaps, the Major conceded, but combined with other evidence, it paints a concerning picture. He turned to Lieutenant Crawford. The tracks at the homestead, what direction did you determine the attackers came from? Crawford stepped forward, playing his part perfectly. East, sir, from the direction of the old trading post, not the Lakota territories to the north. Now, curious, Harland mused. And the timing of the attack? Your assessment, based on decomposition and other factors, between 4 and 5 days ago. Crawford's expression was professionally neutral, coinciding with Mr. Thornton's last reported visit to the area. Thornton's face contorted with rage. You're taking the word of a journal over mine? I've served the territory for 15 years. I was hunting hostiles when you were still at the academy, Harland. I'm not taking anyone's word just yet, the Major replied calmly. Simply gathering facts. Facts like your unsanctioned patrols around my camp, interfering with official army business, making accusations without evidence. The wagon masters. Hand drifted toward his sidearm. I don't need a uniform to protect this territory from Indian lovers and traitors. Harlan's expression hardened. That hand touches your weapon, and you'll be shot where you stand, Mr. Thornton. Lieutenant Crawford and I may be officers, but we're still soldiers. A tense silence fell, stretching several seconds as Thornton weighed his options. Finally, his hand moved away from his gun, though his expression remained murderous. This isn't over, he growled. The governor will hear about this, about how you're protecting the very savages who are killing honest settlers. Oh, the governor will hear all about this, Harlan agreed, including the contents of Miller's journal and my formal recommendation that you be investigated for potential involvement in his family's deaths. Thornton's face went from rage to calculation in an instant. You have no proof I had anything to do with that tragedy, nothing that would stand in any court. Perhaps not yet, the Major acknowledged, but investigations have a way of uncovering unexpected evidence. Your associates, for instance, he gestured to the men flanking Thornton, might find it in their interest to provide information in exchange for leniency. One of the men shifted uncomfortably, not meeting Thornton's gaze when he glanced back. A crack in his support, a potential weak point Harlan had immediately identified and exploited. We're done here, Thornton snapped, backing toward the tent entrance. But remember this, Major. There are powers in this territory beyond your military authority. People who understand what's really at stake in dealing with the Indian problem. Good evening, Mr. Thornton, Harlan replied, dismissal clear in his tone. Lieutenant Crawford will escort you and your men back to the perimeter. I suggest you return to the settlement and await further communication regarding this matter. After they had gone, an uncomfortable silence settled over the command tent. Ellie and Maka emerged from their hiding place, tension still humming, through their bodies despite the immediate danger having passed. He'll be back, Ellie said quietly, with more men or a different approach. Thornton doesn't surrender easily. The Major nodded grimly. I'm aware, but for now, we've bought some time and planted seeds of doubt among his followers. He gestured to the chairs before his desk. Please sit. We have much to discuss before Lieutenant Crawford returns. They seated themselves, Ellie suddenly aware of the bone-deep exhaustion that had been held at bay by adrenaline and necessity. Nearly 2 days without proper rest, constant tension, the persistent awareness of pursuit. It all crashed down upon her now that a moment's respite had been granted. Harlan studied them both, his gaze assessing, but not unkind. You've taken an enormous risk bringing this evidence to me, he said finally. Why? You could have simply returned to your village, prepared your people to leave the area. Because running solves nothing, Ellie answered. The Lakota have already been pushed from their traditional lands further east. How much further must they go? Where does it end? And you believe this journal can change that trajectory? I believe the truth matters, she said simply. The governor's decision to restrict Lakota Territory was based on a lie. The lie that they attacked the Miller family. If that lie is exposed, perhaps other assumptions might be questioned as well. The Major considered this, absently turning the leather-bound journal in his hands. You place a great deal of faith in the power of truth, Miss Morgan. In my experience, it often competes poorly against political expediency. Then why help us at all? Maka asked, speaking for the first time since Thornton's departure. Why not side with Thornton, take easy path? A faint smile touched Harlan's lips. Perhaps I share Miss Morgan's idealism, despite my years of service teaching. Me otherwise. His expression grew more serious. Or perhaps I simply believe that officers of the United States Army should not be party to the murder of innocent families, regardless of the political convenience it might offer. Lieutenant Crawford returned, securing the tent flap behind him. "Thornton and his men have left camp," he reported, "but they're not heading toward the settlement. They're moving parallel to the river, toward the north." "Toward Hidden Springs," Maka said, alarm evident in his voice. "Our village." Ellie felt cold fear grip her heart. "He's going after the village while we're here. A reprisal, or perhaps to create another Indian attack he can use to justify military action." Harland rose from his desk. Decision made. "Lieutenant, have the company ready to move in 20 minutes. Full complement mounted, 3 days provisions." Crawford snapped to attention. "Yes, sir." "Destination?" "We'll follow Thornton. Intercept before he reaches the Lakota village." The major turned. "To Ellie and Maka, I assume you can guide us by the fastest route?" "Yes, but..." Ellie hesitated. "Won't this exceed your authority? The governor hasn't authorized military protection for Lakota settlements." "I'm not acting under the governor's authority," Harlan said grimly. "I'm preventing a civilian militia from committing potential atrocities that would reflect poorly on territorial administration and possibly provoke wider conflict. A peacekeeping mission, fully within my discretion as ranking officer in this region." It was a thin justification, but perhaps enough to shield him from the worst political consequences. Ellie exchanged glances with Maka, seeing her own relief and determination mirrored in his expression. "We need to warn the village," Maka said. "Prepare them." Harlan nodded. "You'll ride ahead with a small detachment, Lieutenant Crawford, and 4 men. The main company will follow, bringing Black Kettle from the North Shore camp as well." The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Horses saddled, supplies distributed, weapons checked and loaded. Ellie and Maka were provided with fresh mounts. The Army's well-fed cavalry horses, a marked improvement over the trail-worn animals they had been using. As they prepared to depart, the first hint of dawn appeared on the eastern horizon. A faint lightening of the sky that promised another clear day. Ellie's shadow sight had faded as Wichapi's medicine wore off, but her natural vision was sharp enough in the growing light. Lieutenant Crawford approached, leading his own horse. "Ready when you are, Miss Morgan. The advance party is assembled." Ellie nodded, turning to where Major Harlan stood conferring with his sergeants. "Thank you," she said simply when he looked her way, "for believing us." The major's expression was solemn. "Don't thank me yet. We're still a long way from resolving this situation, and further still from securing any lasting peace for your adopted people. But it's a start," she insisted. "A chance." "Yes," he agreed after a moment. "A chance, at least." They rode hard as the sun climbed higher, Lieutenant Crawford setting a punishing pace that even Maka approved of. The small detachment made better time than Thornton's larger group, moving across the open plains with single-minded purpose. Ellie rode beside Maka, both of them scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit or danger. The journal was secured in her saddlebag, wrapped carefully in oilcloth to protect it from damage, tangible evidence of the truth they fought to establish. "Do you think we'll reach the village in time?" she asked during a brief pause to rest. "The horses." Maka's expression was grim determination. "Must reach them. Thornton has led, but more men move slower, and does not know all paths like I do." Lieutenant Crawford approached, offering his canteen. "Major Harlan told me about your shadow sight," he said quietly as Ellie drank. "Said you can see things others can't, especially at dawn and dusk." She handed the canteen back, studying his face for signs of skepticism or superstition. Finding none, she nodded cautiously. "It's true, though the medicine that enhances it has worn off now. The old woman, Wichapi, is it? She has more of this medicine at the village." Yes, Ellie confirmed, understanding beginning to dawn. You're thinking I could use it to help locate Thornton's party if we don't intercept them before nightfall. Crawford nodded. Every advantage helps when lives are at stake. It was a practical approach, refreshingly free of the prejudice she had come to expect from most white men regarding native practices. Perhaps there were more allies to be found than she had dared hope. They remounted and continued their journey, the terrain gradually changing as they approached the foothills, where hidden springs nestled in its protected valley. The flat plains gave way to rolling hills, scattered pine groves providing periodic shade from the increasingly warm sun. It was Marka who spotted the first sign of Thornton's passage, a recently abandoned campsite in a small hollow. Ashes, still warm from their morning fire. He dismounted to examine the tracks, counting impressions in the soft earth. 15 men, maybe more, he reported grimly. Moving fast, no care for hiding trail. They're confident, Lieutenant Crawford observed. Either they don't expect pursuit or they don't fear it. How far ahead? Ellie asked, anxiety gnawing at her stomach. The village would be relatively undefended. Many of the best warriors were out on extended hunting trips, preparing for the coming winter. Marka judged the cold remains of the fire, the depth of the hoof prints. 4 hours, maybe less. And how far to the village from here? 6 hours normal pace. 4 if we push horses hard. Crawford made a quick calculation. If they maintain their current speed, they'll reach Hidden Springs by mid-afternoon. We might intercept them just before they arrive, but it will be close. Then we ride harder, Ellie said simply, already turning her horse back to the trail. The lieutenant nodded, impressed by her determination. Agreed. But first, he removed a small mirror from his saddlebag, using it to flash a signal toward a distant ridgeline where the main company would soon be passing. 3 quick flashes, then 2 long, a prearranged signal to indicate they had found Thornton's trail and were in pursuit. An answering flash came moments later, confirming the message had been received. The main force would adjust their route accordingly, though they would still lag behind the faster-moving advance party. They pushed on, following Thornton's increasingly fresh trail as it wound through the foothills. The terrain grew more challenging, narrow passes, steep inclines, rocky ground that threatened the horses' footing if taken too quickly. But Marka led them with confidence, occasionally taking game trails or shortcuts known only to the Lakota, gradually closing the gap between them and their quarry. By early afternoon, the first signs of smoke became visible against the sky ahead. Not the darker smoke of a village's cooking fires, but the thicker, more ominous billowing that suggested something larger burning. Ellie felt her heart constrict with fear. They've reached the village, she said, voice tight with dread. Marka shook his head, studying the smoke pattern. No, not village. Forest fire, smaller. His expression darkened with understanding. Distraction. They burn forest to draw warriors away from village before attack. Lieutenant Crawford immediately grasped the implications. A tactical diversion. Effective, especially if the village has limited defenders. We must split up, Marka decided. I take 2 soldiers, go to fire, warn any warriors there about real threat. He looked at Crawford and Ellie. Continue to village, prepare defense. The lieutenant hesitated only briefly before nodding agreement. Corporal Hayes, Private Wilson, you're with him. The rest of us will proceed to the village. At best, speed. As Marka prepared to lead his small detachment toward the fire, Ellie caught his arm. Be careful, she said softly. Thornton might have left men watching the fire, expecting a response. His hand covered hers briefly, warm and reassuring despite the danger they faced. "See you at village," he said simply, confidence in his voice that brooked no contradiction. Then he was gone, galloping toward the smoke with the two soldiers following close behind, leaving Ellie with Crawford and the remaining two men to continue toward Hidden Springs. The smoke had given them a reference point, allowing Ellie to orient herself more precisely. She took the lead now, guiding them along a route that would bring them to the village from the eastern approach. A direction Thornton would likely avoid, as it offered less cover for an attacking force than the western woods or northern ridge. As they crested a final rise, Hidden Springs came into view below them, the circle of lodges nestled beside the small lake that gave the settlement its name, smoke rising in thin columns from cooking fires, children visible playing near the water's edge. The scene appeared peaceful, unaware of the danger approaching from the opposite side. "No sign of attack yet," Crawford observed, surveying the valley through his field glasses. "But look there." He pointed toward the western edge of the forest that bordered the village. Movement among the trees, their positioning for an assault. Ellie focused on where he indicated, catching glimpses of men and horses moving into concealed positions along the tree line. Thornton was preparing a coordinated attack, likely waiting for full deployment before launching his assault. They had arrived just in time. "We need to get down there," she said urgently. "Warn them." Crawford nodded, then turned to his men. "Private Jenkins, ride back along our trail. When you encounter the main company, inform Major Harland of the situation and guide them in. Private Cooper, with us." They descended the slope at a controlled pace, not wanting to appear as attackers themselves to anyone in the village who might spot their approach. As they neared the outer perimeter of lodges, a cry went up. They had been seen. Several Lakota men emerged from the nearest dwellings, bows and spears at the ready. Ellie immediately rode ahead of the soldiers, hands raised to show she carried no weapon. "It's Eleanor Shadowhunter," she called in Lakota. "Danger comes from the west. Warriors, prepare." Recognition and alarm spread through the small group. One man, Spotted Wolf, who had returned from the confluence as planned, stepped forward. "What danger?" he demanded, eyeing the soldiers warily. "Thornton," Ellie explained rapidly, switching between Lakota and English to ensure both her people and Lieutenant Crawford understood. 15 or more men positioned in the western woods. They set a forest fire to the north as distraction. Maka has gone to warn any warriors there, but we must prepare here immediately. Spotted Wolf absorbed this information with the calm efficiency of an experienced hunter and warrior. "We have few fighters," he said grimly. "Many are still hunting in eastern valleys." "How many can bear arms?" Crawford asked, dismounting to appear less threatening. 20 men, perhaps. Some older boys. The women will fight if needed." The lieutenant nodded, military mind already formulating strategies. "We must get the children and elders to safety first. Is there a defensible position nearby?" "The caves," Ellie suggested, remembering the network of small caverns in the eastern ridge. "They're easily defended and have a water source inside." Spotted Wolf agreed. "Good choice. I will organize evacuation." He turned to several younger men, issuing rapid instructions that set them running to different parts of the village, spreading the alarm. "What about Wichapi?" Ellie asked suddenly, concerned for the old woman overriding tactical considerations for a moment. "Grandmother is with the healers gathering medicines," one of the men reported. "I will bring her." As the evacuation began, Lieutenant Crawford, Ellie, and Private Cooper moved toward the western edge of the village, seeking better observation of Thornton's position without revealing themselves. They used the lodges for cover, working there, way closer to where the threat lurked in the tree line. From a concealed position behind a large storage structure, Crawford surveyed the situation with his field glasses. "I count at least 12 men visible, probably more hidden deeper in the trees. They appear to be waiting for something." "The fire," Ellie realized. "They're waiting to see if more warriors leave the village to fight it, further reducing the Defenses. Crawford nodded grimly. A sound strategy, if brutal in its calculation. What do we do? Ellie asked, frustration building at their limited options. We can't evacuate everyone before they attack, and we don't have enough fighters to mount an effective defense. The lieutenant's expression was resolute. We change the equation, make them uncertain enough to delay until the main company arrives. He turned to Private Cooper. Your bugle, soldier. Cooper produced the instrument from his saddlebag, confusion evident on his face. Sir? When I give the signal, you'll sound assembly, followed by charge, from different positions to suggest a larger force. Crawford's eyes gleamed with tactical inspiration. If Thornton believes the army has arrived in force, he may withdraw rather than engage. It was a gamble, but one that might buy them precious time. Crawford dispatched Cooper to a position near the northern edge of the village, while he took up a location to the south. At his signal, Cooper would sound his bugle calls, then quickly move to a new position and repeat, creating the illusion of multiple buglers, and thus multiple units of soldiers. Meanwhile, Ellie joined Spotted Wolf in organizing the village's defenders. The few warriors present were positioned strategically, with the strongest bows covering the most likely approach routes. Women armed with spears and knives formed a second line of defense around the path to the caves, where the children and elders were being evacuated. Wichapi appeared at Ellie's side as she was helping an elderly man toward the evacuation route, the old woman's expression calm despite the chaos around them. "Grandmother," Ellie said with relief, "you need to go to the caves with the others." Wichapi shook her head firmly. "Old woman not run from fight," she replied in her halting English. "Have medicine for your eye." She pressed a small pouch into Ellie's hand, similar to the one she had provided before their journey to the Miller homestead. "Thank you," Ellie said, touched by the old woman's courage and foresight. "But please, at least move away from the western edge. Stay with the healers, help with any wounded." Wichapi seemed about to argue further when a sharp blast from Cooper's bugle cut through the air, the clear, commanding notes of assembly echoing across the valley. Moments later, from a different position, the call was repeated, then again, from a third location, as Cooper raced between predetermined points. The effect was immediate. Activity in the tree line increased, men moving with greater urgency, horses being brought forward. Through Crawford's field glasses, Ellie could see Thornton gesticulating angrily, apparently arguing with some of his followers, who seemed less certain about proceeding with their attack. Then came the second signal, the stirring, aggressive notes of charge, again repeated from multiple positions. This pushed Thornton's men from uncertainty into near panic. Several mounted immediately, turning their horses eastward as if to flee. Others looked to Thornton for guidance, clearly reluctant to engage what they now believed to be a substantial military force. The ruse was working, buying precious minutes as the evacuation continued and the village's defenders solidified their positions. Ellie allowed herself a moment of hope. Perhaps they could avoid bloodshed entirely, hold out until Major Harland arrived with the main company. That hope was shattered when a single rifle shot cracked across the valley. From his position in the tree line, William Thornton had fired into the air. Not an attack, but a signal to his wavering men, a call to hold their positions. "Cowards," his voice carried clearly in the sudden silence following his shot. "It's a trick. There's no company of soldiers, just Crawford and a couple of men trying to frighten us off." The momentum shifted again, Thornton's men regaining their confidence as they realized the deception. Ellie cursed silently. Their gambit had failed, and now the attack would come with even greater fury, the attackers angry at having been momentarily fooled. Lieutenant Crawford appeared at her side, expression grim but determined. "We've lost the element of doubt," he confirmed. "They'll attack within minutes. How's the evacuation progressing?" "Most of the vulnerable are safely in the caves," Ellie reported. The defenders are in position, but she didn't need to finish the thought. They were outnumbered, outgunned, with only the advantage of defensive positioning. "We hold as long as we can," Crawford said simply. "The main company can't be more than an hour behind us. An hour might as well be an eternity once the shooting started." Ellie nodded anyway, determination replacing fear. She had not come this far, found a new home and purpose, only to lose it. To Thornton's hatred and ambition, she opened Wichapi's medicine pouch, applying the mixture to her blind eye as she had done before. The familiar tingling sensation spread immediately, stronger than previous applications, as if the old woman had concentrated the formula for this crucial moment. The world shifted, her shadow sight expanding dramatically as the medicine took effect. Even in broad daylight, she could now perceive things invisible to normal vision. The tension in Thornton's men as they prepared to attack, the subtle signals passing between them, the positioning of their weapons. "They're coming," she said quietly to Crawford, not needing field glasses to see what her enhanced perception revealed. 3 groups, main force directly from the west, smaller flanking parties from northwest and southwest. They'll try to surround the village center. The lieutenant didn't question how she knew this, simply accepted the intelligence and adjusted their defensive strategy accordingly. "We'll concentrate our strongest defenders against the main thrust. Use mobility to respond to the flanking movements as they develop." The attack, when it came, was swift and violent. Thornton's men emerged from the tree line at a gallop, rifles raised, splitting into the 3 groups Ellie had identified. Leading the central force, Thornton himself rode with reckless abandon, his face contorted with rage and determination. The Lakota defenders released their first volley of arrows as the attackers came within range, the shafts finding several marks despite the difficult target of men on moving horses. 2 of Thornton's riders fell, one dead before he hit the ground, the other rolling to cover, clutching a wounded leg. Return fire came immediately, bullets splintering lodge poles and thudding into the earth around the defenders. Ellie and Crawford had positioned themselves with the central defensive group, using an overturned cart and several large storage vessels as improvised cover. "Hold your fire until they're closer," Crawford instructed Private Cooper, who knelt beside him with his army-issued rifle. "Make every shot count." The first wave of attackers broke against their defensive position like water on rock, forced to veer aside by the concentrated arrow fire and the few precious rifle shots from Crawford and Cooper. But the flanking groups were making progress, threatening to encircle their position, if not checked. "There!" Ellie pointed toward the northern approach, where 3 riders had broken through the thinner defenses. "They're heading for the evacuation route." Crawford made a split-second decision. "Cooper, with Miss Morgan, protect the cave path. I'll hold here with the Lakota fighters." Ellie didn't wait for further instruction, already moving toward the threatened position with Cooper close behind her. Her shadow sight gave her incredible awareness of the battlefield, showing her safe passages between buildings where bullets were less likely to reach, revealing the quickest route to intercept the flanking riders. They reached the path leading toward the caves, just as the 3 attackers crested a small rise, charging toward the vulnerable evacuation route. Cooper took up position behind a large boulder, rifle steady as he aimed at the lead rider. "I'll take the first," he said calmly. "Can you distract the others?" Ellie nodded, already fitting an arrow to her bow, with her shadow sight guiding. Her aim, she loosed the shaft not at the riders themselves, but at the ground directly in front of the second horse. The animal reared in panic, nearly unseating its rider, creating momentary chaos that Cooper exploited to fire his carefully aimed shot. The lead attacker toppled from his saddle, his horse bolting past them toward the village center. The remaining 2 quickly regrouped, one firing wildly in their direction, while the other circled to approach from a different angle. A bullet splintered the rock near Cooper's head, forcing him to duck lower as he reloaded. Ellie launched another arrow, this one striking the circling rider in the shoulder. The man cried out but remained mounted, drawing a pistol with his uninjured arm. The exchange of fire continued for several tense moments, neither side gaining decisive advantage. Then a new sound cut through the din of battle, the rhythmic thundering of many hooves approaching from the east, accompanied by the unmistakable notes of an army bugle. "The main company," Cooper exclaimed, relief evident in his voice. "They've arrived." The two attackers apparently reached the same conclusion, immediately abandoning their assault and wheeling their horses to retreat. As they fled back toward the village center, presumably to warn Thornton and the others, Ellie and Cooper advanced cautiously along the path to ensure no further threats to the evacuation route. From their elevated position, they could see Major Harlan's company pouring into the valley from the eastern approach, at least 40 mounted soldiers in formation, the afternoon sun glinting off rifle barrels and brass buttons. At their head rode Harlan himself, with Marker and Black Kettle close behind. The effect on the battlefield was immediate and dramatic. Thornton's men, already struggling against the determined Lakota defense, now found themselves caught between two forces. Some immediately broke and ran, heading for the western forest from which they had launched their attack. Others, closer to Thornton's position near the village center, hesitated, awaiting direction from their increasingly desperate leader. "We need to rejoin Lieutenant Crawford," Ellie said, already moving back toward the main defensive position. "Thornton might attempt something reckless when he realizes he's trapped." They hurried through the village, skirting areas where fighting was still ongoing. Ellie's shadow sight allowed her to navigate safely, detecting danger before it materialized, guiding them through paths where bullets and arrows were less likely to find them. They found Crawford still at the central position, bleeding from a graze to his left arm, but otherwise unharmed. Around him, several Lakota defenders nursed minor wounds while continuing to hold their position against what had become a half-hearted assault. "The company has arrived," Ellie reported, relief evident in her voice. "Thornton's men are breaking ranks, fleeing toward the west." Crawford nodded grimly. "Not all of them. Thornton himself and his core followers have barricaded themselves. In that large lodge," he pointed toward what had once been a communal meeting structure near the village center. "They've taken hostages." Ellie's heart sank. "Who?" "3 women who couldn't make it to the caves in time. One of them is your friend, the old medicine woman, Wichapi." The name emerged as barely more than a whisper, fear constricting Ellie's throat. The old woman who had saved her life, taught her medicine, helped transform her blindness into a gift, now in the hands of a man like Thornton. At that moment, Major Harlan's advance elements reached their position, Maka among them. He dismounted. In haste, his expression clouded with concern as he took in the situation. "Grandmother?" he asked immediately, scanning the defenders for Wichapi's familiar figure. The pain in Ellie's eyes told him everything before she could speak. "Thornton has her," she said, "along with 2 others. They're barricaded in the council lodge." Maka's face hardened, hand moving to the knife at his belt. Before he could act on his impulse, Major Harlan joined them, quickly assessing the tactical situation. "Lieutenant Crawford, report," he ordered crisply. "Thornton and approximately 6 men have taken refuge in that structure," Crawford indicated the lodge. "They're holding 3 Lakota women hostage. The rest of his force has either been neutralized or has fled into the western forest, where some of our men are currently in pursuit." Harlan nodded, his expression grim. A desperate last stand. He knows the consequences if he's captured now. Murder, inciting violence, attacking a peaceful settlement. He's facing a hangman's noose, and he knows it. "What do we do?" Ellie asked, fear for Wichapi overshadowing all other concerns. "Standard procedure would be to surround the position, call for surrender, and wait them out," the major replied. "But with hostages involved, particularly elderly ones? He left the Khe, implication unspoken. Thornton might kill the women out of spite before surrendering, or use them as human shields in a desperate breakout attempt. "I can get in," Ellie said suddenly, the beginning of a plan forming in her mind. "My shadow sight shows me things others can't see, weaknesses, patterns, intentions. If I can get close enough, I might find a way inside that Thornton doesn't expect." Harlan looked skeptical. "Too dangerous. One wrong move and the hostages die." "Believe her," Maka interjected, his voice firm. "Shadow hunter sees true, finds path where others see only wall." The Major studied them both, weighing options against rapidly diminishing time. "What do you propose?" "Create a distraction," Ellie explained. "Make Thornton believe you're preparing for an assault from the front. While his attention is focused there, I'll find another way in, from the side or rear." "You won't go alone," Maka stated. Not a request, but a declaration. Ellie nodded, grateful for his support, but practical about their chances. "Just us. More would be detected." Harlan considered the plan, soldier's instinct warring with military protocol. Finally, he nodded once. Decision made. "Lieutenant Crawford, organize a visible deployment to the front of the structure. Make it obvious. I want Thornton watching your every move. Captain Lewis," he called to another officer, "establish a perimeter. No one gets past without my direct order." As the soldiers moved to execute these commands, Harlan turned back to Ellie and Maka. "You have until sunset. If you haven't succeeded by then, I'll have no choice but to attempt a direct assault, hostages or no. The territory's safety must take precedence." Ellie understood the implicit message. This was their only chance to save Wichapi and the others. After sunset, military necessity would dictate Harlan's actions, regardless of the human cost. They retreated to a sheltered position where they could observe the council lodge without being seen. Ellie applied more of Wichapi's medicine to her eye, the tingling sensation stronger than ever as the mixture took effect. Her shadow sight expanded dramatically, revealing details that would remain invisible to others. The pattern of guards. Inside the lodge, visible through thin spots in the hide covering. The subtle weaknesses in the structure's construction. The movement of the hostages, bound but alive near the rear wall. "Thornton has them there," she whispered, pointing to the northwestern corner of the lodge. "Two guards watching them directly. Thornton himself paces near the entrance, 3 more men positioned around the interior." Maka absorbed this information silently, his expression betraying nothing of the turmoil he must feel, knowing his grandmother was in such danger. "How we enter?" he asked simply. Ellie's enhanced vision probed the structure carefully, seeking vulnerability. "There," she indicated after several moments of intense study, "the smoke hole at the peak. The supporting poles have been weakened by last month's storms. I can see the stress patterns in the wood. If we can reach the roof undetected—" "No." A guard looks up, Maka noted, seeing the wisdom in her plan. "All watch ground, expect attack from land." They mapped their approach, a circuitous route that would use other structures for cover, bringing them to the rear of the council lodge, where a storage lean-to offered access to the lower part of the roof. From there, they could climb to the smoke hole at the peak, an opening normally used to vent cooking fires, but large enough for a person to slip through if careful. As Crawford's men created their diversion, ostentatiously positioning sharpshooters, and calling loudly for Thornton to surrender, Ellie and Maka began their stealthy approach. They moved from shadow to shadow, using Ellie's enhanced perception to avoid detection, freezing in place whenever one of Thornton's lookouts glanced in their direction. Reaching the storage lean-to, they paused, catching their breath and preparing for the most dangerous part of their plan. Once on the roof, they would be exposed, visible to anyone who happened to look up or to perimeter guards who might spot them from a distance. "Ready?" Ellie whispered, checking her knife and ensuring the small hunting bow strapped to her back wouldn't impede her movement. Maka nodded, his expression resolute. "For grandmother, for our people." They ascended the lean-to's sloped side, movements careful and deliberate to minimize noise and vibration. The council lodge's roof began just above this structure, its covering stretched over a wooden framework. They transferred to this surface with painstaking slowness, distributing their weight to avoid creating sounds that might alert those inside. Crawling on hands and knees, they made their way up the gentle incline toward the smoke hole at the peak. Ellie led, her shadow sight warning of weak spots in the roof's construction, guiding their path across the sturdiest sections. Behind her, Maka moved with the silent grace of a lifetime hunter, his larger frame somehow no less agile than hers. At the smoke hole, they paused again. Ellie peered through the opening, her enhanced vision penetrating the relative darkness inside. She could see Thornton pacing anxiously, barking occasional orders at his men. The hostages remained huddled in the corner, Wichapi's face impassive despite her predicament, the old woman's dignity intact, even in captivity. Ellie mapped the interior carefully, noting the positions of Thornton's men, calculating angles and distances. Satisfied with her assessment, she turned to Maka, outlining her plan in whispered Lakota, too quiet for those below to hear. He listened intently, then nodded once, removing a coil of thin rope from his belt. They secured it to one of the sturdier roof supports, testing its strength before proceeding with the next phase of their desperate rescue. Ellie went first, lowering herself through the smoke hole with exquisite care, using the rope to control her descent. Her shadow sight guided her, showing her exactly when to pause as one of Thornton's men glanced upward, exactly when to continue when his attention returned to the front entrance where the army's diversion continued. She touched down silently on a storage platform built into the lodge's interior wall, concealed from direct view by hanging hides and bundles of dried herbs. From this position, she had a clear line of sight to the hostages, still guarded by two of Thornton's men, while the others maintained watch on the main entrance. Maka followed, his descent as silent as her own, joining her on the platform with barely a whisper of movement. They exchanged glances, silent communication born of months of hunting together, then separated, Maka moving along the platform toward one guard, Ellie toward the other. The lodge interior was hazy with smoke from a small fire, adding to the concealment their elevated position provided. Ellie drew her knife, measuring the distance to her target, waiting for the perfect moment when Thornton's attention was fully absorbed by the army's theatrics outside. That moment came when a bullhorn amplified demand for surrender echoed from beyond the entrance, Major Harland following through on his promise of a convincing diversion. Thornton stormed to the doorway, shouting obscenities and threats, drawing his men's attention with his volatile response. Ellie and Maka moved simultaneously, dropping from their elevated positions directly behind the two guards, watching the hostages. Before either man could react, they struck, Maka's arm locking around one guard's throat in a stranglehold, Ellie's knife pressed against the other's kidney, her free hand covering his mouth to stifle any cry of alarm. Within seconds, both guards were neutralized, unconscious rather than dead, a mercy Ellie insisted upon despite the risk it posed. They quickly cut the hostages' bonds, Wichapi's eyes widening slightly in recognition as she realized who her rescuers were. "Quiet," Ellie mouthed, pointing upward toward their escape route. The old woman nodded, understanding, her composure remarkable given the circumstances. Getting the hostages to the roof presented a new challenge. The younger women could climb with assistance, but Wichapi's age made the vertical ascent impossible for her. They would need another way out, or a different plan entirely. Before they could decide, disaster struck. One of Thornton's men, turning to check on the hostages, spotted the unconscious guards and the partially freed captives. His shout of alarm brought all activity to a momentary standstill, then exploded into chaotic action. Thornton spun from his position by the door, pistol already drawn. His eyes widened in shock and rage when he saw Ellie. "You," he snarled, recognition and hatred twisting his features. "Should have killed you when I had the chance." He fired without further warning, the bullet splintering the post near Ellie's head. She dove for cover, pulling Wichapi down with her as Maka shielded the other women with his body. Chaos engulfed the lodge. Thornton's remaining men scrambling for weapons and position, the freed hostages seeking shelter behind whatever meager cover the interior provided. Outside, hearing the gunshot, Major Harland abandoned the pretense of negotiation, ordering his men to prepare for immediate assault. "Get them out!" Ellie shouted to Maka, indicating the rope still dangling from the smoke hole. "I'll hold them off!" Maka hesitated, torn between the mission and leaving her behind. Another shot from Thornton's pistol decided him. They needed to act now, or all would be lost. He began helping the first woman climb the rope, while Ellie provided covering fire with her bow, forcing Thornton and his men to seek shelter rather than rush their position. The first hostage disappeared through the smoke hole, pulled to safety by soldiers who had now reached the roof in response to the gunfire. The second woman followed, her ascent more awkward but ultimately successful. Only Wichapi remained, the old woman standing calmly amidst the chaos, her dark eyes fixed on something only she could see. When Maka moved to help her toward the rope, she shook her head firmly. "No," she said in Lakota, "not my path." Before either Ellie or Maka could respond, the lodge's main entrance burst inward, Lieutenant Crawford leading a charge of soldiers into the interior, rifles leveled at Thornton and his remaining men. In that moment of confusion, Thornton made his desperate move. Breaking from cover, he lunged toward Wichapi, grabbing the old woman and pressing his pistol to her head. "Nobody move!" he shouted, backing toward a side exit with his human shield. "I'm walking out of here, or she dies first." The soldiers froze, unable to fire without risking the hostage. Maka tensed, preparing to spring despite the impossible odds, but Ellie's hand on his arm held him back. Her shadow sight had detected something the others couldn't see, a subtle shift in Wichapi's posture, a calculated preparation rather than fearful submission. "It's over, Thornton!" Major Harlan's voice cut through the tension as he entered behind his men. "Surrender now, and I'll ensure you receive a fair trial." Thornton laughed, the sound harsh and unhinged. "Fair trial? We both know what that means. No, I'm leaving, and if anyone tries to stop me, this savage witch dies first." As he began edging toward the exit, Wichapi's hand moved slightly. A small object clutched in her gnarled fingers, a pouch similar to the one she had given Ellie, but different in its markings. With movements too subtle for Thornton to detect, she opened it, releasing a fine powder into the air around his face. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Thornton gasped, inhaling the substance involuntarily. His eyes widened in shock, then confusion, his grip on Wichapi loosening as he staggered backward. The pistol wavered, then dropped from suddenly nerveless fingers as he clawed at his throat, fighting for breath that wouldn't come. Wichapi stepped calmly away from him, her expression neither triumphant nor vengeful, simply the face of one who had administered necessary medicine, harsh though its effects might be. Thornton collapsed to his knees, his men throwing down their weapons in surrender as soldiers closed in around them. The wagon master's face had taken on a bluish tinge, his breathing shallow and labored, but he would live. Wichapi's poison calculated to incapacitate rather than kill, justice tempered with mercy that Thornton himself had never shown. As order was restored, prisoners secured, and the last embers of conflict extinguished, Ellie found herself standing between two worlds that had seemed irreconcilable just days before. On one side, Major Harland and his soldiers, representatives of the government that had sought to confine and control the Lakota. On the other, Maka, Wichapi, and the people who had become her family when she had nothing left. Yet here, they, All stood together in this moment of shared victory against a man whose hatred had nearly destroyed everything. Perhaps there was hope after all, not for perfect understanding or immediate harmony, but for a beginning, a foundation upon which something better might be built. Major Harland approached, Miller's journal in hand. This evidence, combined with today's events, should be enough to convince even the most skeptical territorial officials that Thornton was manipulating information to provoke conflict. And the Lakota? Ellie asked, the question that mattered most. Will they still be forced onto the small reservation? The Major's expression was cautiously optimistic. I believe we can negotiate better terms now, not everything you hoped for, perhaps, but enough to preserve dignity and essential hunting grounds. He glanced at Wichapi, respect evident in his gaze, and perhaps arrangements for cultural exchange, their medicine, our education, a true beginning. As sunset painted the valley in hues of gold and crimson, Ellie stood on the ridge overlooking hidden springs, Maka beside her. Below, soldiers and Lakota worked together to repair damage from the brief but intense battle, shared purpose temporarily bridging ancient divides. What happens now? Maka asked, echoing a question he had posed months before when she first began to find her place among his people. Ellie touched her blind eye, the gift of shadow sight still active within it. A bridge between worlds, just as she herself had become. Now we build something new, she said simply, something that honors both paths while creating a third for those who walk between. Wichapi joined them on the ridge, her ancient face serene in the fading light. She pointed to the blank space on the hide painting that had remained unfilled all these months, the space designated for the future, for possibilities yet unrealized. Now, the old woman said in her halting English, you know what to paint. There! And Ellie did. Not an ending, those were rarely as neat and final as stories pretended, but a continuation, a path forward, difficult but possible, illuminated by the unique vision of one who had been abandoned for her blindness, only to discover that true sight came in many forms, the most powerful being the ability to see beyond limitations to possibilities, yet unborn. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.